So this is our final session on this book, Early Greek Thinking by Heidegger. This time we're talking about the second of the two Heraclitus fragments, the Aletheia fragment, as he calls it. Although Aletheia, the word, doesn't actually appear in the fragment, Lathoi does at the end of it. It is the one that's usually translated, how can one hide before that which never sets? That's the Dial's translation, at least. But there's lots of other things he's taking on in the essay as a whole. It's only about 20 odd pages, 25 pages or less. But because it's our last one, we'll also wrap up the book. And then in addition to getting people's reactions to the reading and talking about wrapping up the book, we can talk about what we're going to do next. Last time we got a suggestion from Pete that one of the things we might do would be what is called Thinking. This book by Heidegger came out in the 50s. And I agree, it's a very good fit for where we are now. It kind of starts off with some contemporary stuff, sort of throat clearing as usual, and his own sort of putting in his own questioning sort of problematic, and then rapidly goes into Nietzsche, and especially the Thus Spoke Zarathustra stuff in Nietzsche, and Overman, Last Man kind of doctrines in Nietzsche, that sort of thing. And that takes us through the first part, and then in the second part, he turns to the early Greeks again, and by the middle of the second part, we're reading Parmenides again. So back to some of the fundamentals of early Greek thinking, all more in a frame of his own mature thought. He's trying to steer people towards some mature thought, but we get the same kind of reactions to Nietzsche on the one hand, reaction to the early Greeks on the other, trying to put his own ideas together with reactions to both those things. So that's the basic substance of the book. It's got 2 parts and multiple lectures in each part, it's like a dozen. And from the natural division of it, I think we want to, there's 10 lectures in part 1, 11 in part 2. I think we want to, there's some particularly weighty material at the end of part 1 where we want to go a little bit slower, right? But the natural way to do part 1 is the first 4, the next 4, the last 2. And then for part 2, we would do it in 2 more sessions. So it would take 6 sessions to do this. But I think it's worth it. It's a good book. Anyway, this is the book to get. This is the translation I'll be using. If there's others out there, this one is Glenn Gray's translation, Harper Perennial, and should be available on Amazon. I'll put the link for next time. And the idea is that over 6 sessions, we would run through this. And this will get us some of the same kind of era of reflections as what we're getting in the later parts of this early Greek thinking book, but it's also more Heidegger's own mature voice, if I put it that way. It's not his 30s voice. It's not his academic, well, it's not his professor to students academic like he was in the late 20s and early 30s. It's he's back after a long hiatus caused by the war. Anyway, that's what this is, and that's what we're gonna do next. So, any questions about that or thoughts, comments on it before we? All right, everyone's okay with that. All right, so we want to do a usual round of did the reading how recently, first reactions to this one. We have some of our usual challenges of he's giving these translations of single words in Greek when he finally gets to translating the whole fragment like halfway through, and then he goes up to kind of a crescendo of trying to explain what he sees as the philosophical view he finds in Heraclitus, and then I think ties that together with some of his own thought. But we'll get to the overview of what's in it after we get first reactions. Craig, you want to start us off?
Okay, I finished reading it yesterday, so I had put it off since we delayed for a week.
Yep.
Biggest issue I had was his kind of wandering through the whole thing and keeps admitting that we really don't know if this is truly Heraclitus' full intention or not, because it's only the fragment. So he waffles on that a little bit, which I thought was interesting. And again, you've already mentioned the problem with a number of the Greek words that were just variants that he was playing around with. But kind of an interesting read, but I'm looking forward to hearing where the discussion goes with it, because I don't feel like I really reached a conclusion on it yet. So
Okay, fair. I mean, one of the things he's sort of what he himself uses at stake in the essay, he makes these nods at various times to scholarship thinks this and later thinkers read that into it and so forth. But often those are just the sort of throat clearing qualifications to win the ground to say what he wants to say. And his own attitude is the thing that matters most is us actually thinking about the matter Heraclitus was trying to think about. And if reading him lets us do that, it's done its job, irregardless of whether or not we arrive at some, theoretically perfect conclusion of this is the historical Heraclitus or something like that. And he disclaims that is at various points along the way. That is, he says, you shouldn't think that this is going to be, the final, reading of Heraclitus. What makes these things valuable is that there isn't a final reading of them, but that they, spark thinking over and over again. He manages to say that at the same time that he's throwing brickbats at other people for misunderstanding him. So, the usual things like that, which we'll get to. There's some sharp humor available if you apply to his own readings, some of the things he applies to other people's readings, and so on. But the overall thing he's trying to do here is saying engage with the philosophical problems Heraclitus himself was engaged in, insofar as you can see him what he's talking about, and that way it will spark thinking, something like that. And the thinking that it sparks is more important than whether, to him at least, than whether or not we have perfectly recaptured things which he must have thought. And when after he goes through an elaborate reconstruction of what he thinks Heraclitus is saying, he'll say something like, is this what Heraclitus was saying? Was this what Heraclitus was thinking, rather? We don't know, but we know it's there in the words he wrote because we can see them there, right? We can read them in there, right? So anyway, his standard of reading here is more what will it spark off for us philosophically than, he's not trying to be an historian here, right? It's a philosophical prompt, so to speak.
Yeah, there was a point though that I did realize it was interesting to keep in the back of my mind the worldview of the time that he was writing it, the worldview of the time that Heidegger was writing, and our worldview today.
Absolutely.
Really three different worldviews, and how does this thread carry with what Heraclitus said then to how we view the world now, especially when we started talking about the lighting and the
yes, and
all that kind of stuff.
And even more than those, because one of the first things he does when he's talking about it says, and Clement of Alexandria saw this in it, and that was his own reading of it. And then he'll say, oh, well, let's look at what the meaning of this word was for the Greeks, and he goes to Homer, right? So there's an after still in the classical world interpretation of or reception of Heraclitus. There's also the looming figures of the Socratics reactions to him and how he appears in Plato and so forth. All of that, but then there's also a before that gets referenced to what's there in the words themselves and the language themselves, which sometimes almost doesn't treat Heraclitus as a distinctive thing among the Greeks, but only as like a carrier for the Greek way of thinking or something. So we've got at least three different, if not more, points of view even back then, and then we have how the modern historians read it. The people who are doing the translating like Dials and Voss and so forth, and then how he reads it, and then how we read it with him, right? Because you have to ask, is he our Clement, right? So you get the point. You get multiple voices in each of these places, but and it is useful to sort of be aware of those things and to think them over, to see if some of his rhetorical moves can be played on himself and so forth. In the end, I don't think those things decide very much. We have to actually wrestle with the weight of each of the thoughts in each of these positions, rather than the mere positioning of them. The mere positioning of them doesn't tell us very much, right? It's not like a thought is more truly and authentically Heraclitus's own if it was in Greek language before him than if it was in Christian thought after him. We don't know that. Heraclitus could have been violently disagreeing with what Homer thought on the point, and Clement could have gotten the point he was trying to make, and so on. So the only thing for it is to go into the matter itself in each case, and judge for ourselves. But fair comments. Joe.
My mic's on. Yes, good. Well, I'm very much in sympathy with the way in which Heidegger concluded the reading. This was all very obscure. But I think maybe I was confused. You just explained. I think maybe I was confused by the multiple voices or points of view that kept sort of going back and forth and threading it. Because I read the first half of the reading very slowly, very tightly, like every paragraph twice, going back, and I began to realize that I was doing a lot of digging and not really getting a lot of nice things dug up. So I started speeding up. First, I took a break, and then I speeded up and this morning went through the last 10 pages, trying to read the topic sentences of each paragraph, glance through the follow-up, and then read the next paragraph and just sort of step through it because I wanted to cover the whole thing. But I think that in the end, Heidegger's own explication of the confusion of interpretation left me confused. I mean, I felt it. So I'm looking forward to the discussion very much.
Yeah, I think that one of the other things going on in the last part of the essay is he is explaining a thought he is imputing to Heraclitus, which is also close to things he's thinking himself, and he's
make more sense to me.
Right, and it is high praise when Heidegger does that with someone, right? It's like he's seeing intimations of thoughts that he himself would be proud to have to think in the earlier thinker, and then after he does that, he'll say, "Does that mean that this is what he thought?" Right? Because he's not signing on the dotted line as to whether or not that reflection that he just gave you is his own or is Heraclitus's. He's agnostic on the point, so to speak, where he thinks that it's Heraclitus's and he's captured it, but he knows that he has put a significant amount of the actual philosophical meat on the bone, so to speak. But he thinks that that's a matter of him being in sympathy with with what Heraclitus was trying to think about. And I think that that's fair. I think that's where, this is why you don't want someone who is only a scholar of Greek to try to interpret Heraclitus for you. You want someone who's a philosopher who can see the same concerns and can think in terms of the same concerns. Does he tend to assimilate Heraclitus most to his own positions and see the places where Heraclitus' positions line up with his own? Undoubtedly, so does Clement, right? It's a natural thing in reading these folks, and you can go hunting around not in the fragments he picked to say the things he wanted to say, but in other fragments of Heraclitus, and you could make a case that he's leaving out some important aspects of Heraclitus's own view or position. That's kind of fine, right? I mean, it's sort of par for the course. You don't expect him to completely agree with a philosopher from 2,500 years ago. It's enough if we can make that philosopher's thought come alive for us and use him to invite us to enter into the same problem they're both considering. So I really like the ending of this. I like the amount of the element of praise that is involved in thinking along with Heraclitus and blurring the line between this is what Heraclitus thought, this is what I think, because there's a measure of agreement if we're both trying to think about the same thing, and there's a one controlling truth that could determine what we're thinking about it, something like that. I find that attractive. I find that it's showing what peak communication can be in philosophy to me, something like that, between minds across that much divide. And if we get to enter into that, great. Now, to enter into that is not easy. We have to think those thoughts with them too, right? So that's why we'll have some explication about it. But if the last sections seem like they tighten up and become, the kind of things you can follow, even if they're mystical at times, it's because that's more closer to Heidegger's own voice. He's saying things he believes, right? As well as that he sees in Heraclitus, in my opinion. All right, Pete.
Yeah, so I read it, and actually a few times. Partly I was going through my online version of it, and every time I went through it, I found more OCR things to fix. So I then have to go back and revisit it. And I read it for last week or whenever we're going to have it, and then realized, oh, it's been moved. And I went through it again this morning, and sort of similar reaction to the others, that I get where he starts from, and where he ends up seems like familiar Heidegger terrain. I mean, this time it's mortals are irrevocably bound to the revealing, concealing, gathering, which lights everything present in its presencing. Okay, yeah, that kind of familiar Heidegger territory there. But as far as following him all the way through this, I kind of got lost in the Greek, and especially when he starts appealing to other fragments and what the words meant there. I kind of, I can't keep the whole chain together. One thing I think he's going for this time is removing agency from people, like with Ulysses, Odysseus. He's not crying, his eyes are tearing. And some of the things like the never setting is, well, what is it that's never setting? Well, it's in a passive voice, or it's not really a thing. So I think that's one of his themes this time is show, I think it's part of his releasement Gelassenheit stuff he was doing in the later Heidegger. We have to listen for what being is doing, rather than people actively doing stuff through their agency. So that's my impression of this one.
Yeah, so some of that, I mean, I think that's fair in terms of the emphasis, especially compared to something like the practical side emphasis of being in time, of everything's projected onto your own possibilities for action kind of stuff. And that is headed more towards something like the later releasement idea. Some of it, though, is there in the original Greek, because the Greek has this construction of the middle voice, which is used for anything which is a reflexive thing. It's, when you're saying something in Greek that happens to yourself, you don't say it in the active voice, I did this, and you don't say it in the passive voice, this happened to me. You say it in this middle voice where the self-reference is, and the balance between it's happening to you and you're doing it is just there in the form itself. It has a separate grammatical form that isn't either active or passive, but is middle voice, and it only ever gets used, well, not ever. It normally gets used only when there's something about the verb which is referring to yourself as both the object and the subject of the action. It's not even an object or subject. It doesn't have object or subjectness to it, which is one of the things that's appealing to it about Heidegger. It seems to be prior to that. So he loves the middle voice constructions in Greek because they seem to have this same between the subject-object dipole that he wants for something like Dasein itself. I think that is one of the ways in which Greek thought appeals to him and is steering in that direction. Certainly things about playing with the direction of the event occurring as opposed to what we do is definitely going on in this and in later Heidegger generally. There is some agency in that, but the initiation of the agency is somewhere else. What do I mean by that? I mean, this is when you're talking about things like the call or the event or responding to it or being appropriated by those sorts of constructions are all ways in which it's something like the truth or the content of the experience is active with respect to us, not just the other way around. And he's not the first philosopher to use that sort of thing. There's similar thought, although it's often a little bit obscured, in some of the teleological thinking you get in Aristotle and in Plato, in terms of the way the good acts. You can even see that in some of the psychology of the fathers who are talking about, the good acting on us, right? Those sorts of things are related, and some of them have the same roots in the Greek thought about those things. But yeah, this we're definitely not in the world of all of these things are the intentional acts of a subject, right? I don't know that we were even back in being in time, because although the structure we were exploring was described as being oriented on our own possibilities, the objectivity with which it was described was not, right? That structure wasn't just one of our own possibilities. It was something like the structure of possibilities, the condition of our possibilities being our possibilities, something like that. You get the point. There was already this is rather than does aspect there in the early Heidegger too. But it's definitely coming out more. And I think that after the whole technology episode and encounter with Nietzsche, he is much more sensitive to this issue about whether or not reducing human agency to will in a Nietzschean sense is a narrowing and distortion of something like openness to objective being or to being itself, or something like that. And that's, to me, part of the characteristic difference between the early and later Heidegger. And I agree that it's full on towards the later part here, right? In the later parts, especially. Okay, Dan, first reactions.
Yeah. So going back to just what you just mentioned, I remember Heidegger saying that in being in time, his language, he said that direction was good, but his language was still metaphysical. And one way he refers to, he still carried this intentionality, subject, object, even if not directly, but they were there in the background. And he denounced that when looking back at being in time, and he tried to move away from that. Anyway, so the book, I read it, I think, twice, and I read it the last time, the second time I read it before our group started. So I don't remember much like details, but I will try next time, probably the next book, to read before the sessions to be more in tune with you guys. And I think what you also, what was mentioned here, I really like that. Like Heraclitus, everyone is saying, I know, obscure, he was the fire guy, and whatever he did and he said, and like he was an aristocrat and so on, and he was like that or not like that. But I think that's trivial in a way, like what you said. It's like Heidegger is taking an idea and he goes with that as deep as he can, and he engaged with the thinker with one idea, and I think that's what I really appreciate about it. I don't know, reading Heidegger, and especially when he engages someone like Heraclitus or Plato or Kant and so on, is this kind of taking something and going as deep as he can. And yeah, I love that.
I agree. I mean, I like that he goes down to the depths. I mean, one thing which, to Craig's point, it's not always obvious when he's doing that if the depths he's going down to are purely that thinker's own thought, when he's trying to ground what he could mean by a word in how Homer used it and something like that, or when he's bringing in the interpretation of another passage that he hasn't really explicated yet. These can all be places where, you know, something looks like it's flying in from left field from the standpoint of I'm just trying to get at what Heraclitus's coherent thought is. He has to make up for that by giving you, after he's, you know, assembled his material, so to speak, not an argument, but a portrait, right? He has to, you know, give you something where the coherence and depth of what he finally presents looks like, yes, that could have been what Heraclitus was actually getting at. And the individual steps along the way to that are always going to be more controversial than the outcome, because it's not a deduction, right? It's a taking hints to try to arrive at an intuitive grasp, and then having fully painted the intuitive grasp, you have to check it against the original and the problem itself, and see if it seems to tally, see if it seems to make sense. And there are some philosophers, especially analytically trained philosophers, this drives batty, right? Because it's like dispensing with the rigor of the argument or something. And others who won't mind it, who just think it's a more of a general humanities way of, you know, gathering the hints of what a poet is talking about and before giving an interpretation of a poem or something. It's more like that, because he's trying to get to an intuitive grasp by seeing the same issues and problems that he thinks the other mind has seen first. So, but yeah, I do like that about him, especially I see in that a capacity for being open to the other thinker's experience, right? I think the degree of Heidegger's open to that does vary with somewhat with how close that thinker is to himself. Like in this essay in particular, right? Early on, he mentions Clement's reading of Heraclitus, and he mentions it like in just a couple of sentences, pretty much to dismiss it. And he doesn't even go into, it doesn't really do us any good to say that this interpretation is wrong, right? Which is like a backhanded way of saying it's wrong, right? Without trying to give the argument why. But he expects you to be way more open to his port of what Heraclitus thinks than he was to what Clement thought about it, right? So sometimes you get the impression that he doesn't think that we're standing on the shoulders of giants, but that all the intervening giants have just put a lot of smoke and mist between us and the previous thinker that we have to get out of the way. So so there are elements like that where I'm less sympathetic to some of the moves he sometimes makes, but sometimes he's just doing that because he has to win enough space to say his own thing, right? You have to get all the intervening crowd that's trying to jump between you and the audience you're trying to speak to out of the way, so you can say what you want instead of just having everybody hear what 16 other people have already said. So I in other words, I can rhetorically sympathize with that a little bit, but I think it does at times make him flip with some of the thinkers along the way that he references. He doesn't do that with the guy he's investigating, right? He doesn't do that with, in this case here, with Heraclitus. He's going to take that seriously. But if somebody else had an interpretation of Heraclitus along the way, you can't expect that it's going to get the most judicious and fair treatment or the same kind of depth of entering into what he could possibly have meant, right? He's got that reserve for the particular thinker he's trying to grapple with, and he's not going to extend it to everyone else in the same essay. Jim. What's up, Shalom?
I read through it this morning. It was stupid of me to think I could get through 20 pages easily. But I still, while there's a lot of new ideas that were introduced, the lighting in particular, and then how it connects with revealing and unconcealment and the realm of realms, and there's a lot, I really enjoyed a lot of the way he was, I felt like a little bit more of a new journey for me in the way that he speaks. In particular, I think what's sticking in my mind, I think it's on page 119, where I better just look at it because I won't remember from. The lighting, therefore, is no mere brightening and lightening, because presencing means to come enduringly forward from concealment to unconcealment, to revealing, concealing, lighting. The revealing, concealing, lighting is concerned with the presencing of what is presence. And of course, it goes into a however, which ruins the moment.
Yeah.
But because first, it's that one, like, but it's so. I think that phrase really hit me as a really nice. It's really strange for me to feel like Heidegger makes things become concise and even starts with a therefore, which is, oh my gosh, a conclusion. You're kidding me. Which I'd like to get deeper into that. I think there's something about that phrase there. We talked a little bit about the standing in front of a tree thing,
which will come next time. But keep going.
Yeah, but to me, that really started to look at me as that thing. That I don't totally understand that, but I'm starting to wonder about that phrase. Jumped out as like, this is that experience of unconcealment. You're participating in unconcealment in that moment. I don't know. It's so hard to put.
Yes, and so and what I mean, yes, he's using the term the lighting for it, and that is meant to be a term which is like halfway between how Heraclitus would think of it and how he himself would think of it. But the lighting is something like the foreground sphere, place, site where the opening of appearing occurs, and the point is that is It's something like truth. It's the realm of truth. You're participating in. You feel yourself as inhabiting, as living in the abode of the place where truth is occurring as an ongoing event. Right. That's the thought he's getting at, and he's seeing that thought in Heraclitus, I think, accurately, as well as in his own thought about Dasein and the clearing and so forth. I would also add that back in the earlier Heidegger, toward the end of Basic Problems of Phenomenology, we also saw this structure brought out when he was trying to give the enveloping presence, the realm of the light of the enveloping presence on which the different ecstasies of time was projected, something like that, which he was interpreting as time, but which he was also relating to Plato thinking of as the good. And then we saw some of that again in the allegory of the cave discussion and the reorientation, interpretation of the reorientation there as towards that light, when he talked about the role of the light in the Platonic idea of the good, light metaphysics, so to speak, as the lightning arena in which the beings could appear. So there are definite parallels here between the lighting as he sees it in Heraclitus, the way he discussed the good as what is projected as beyond being in the discussion of Plato, and his own explication of the structures of temporality at the end of Basic Problems, where it's not as developed in this way, but he's moving away from thinking of it just structurally like he did then to thinking of it as this not just a place or site, but as an ongoing event of the revealing of truth, something like that.
Mhm.
The other accent that's here, though, is that he's also thinking of that that lighting appearing as being a two-sided thing, not a one-sided thing. It's not just the foreground of light; it's also the experience / intuition of that as an arising appearing, which means it's a coming out of as well. There's a prior concealment out of which unconcealment is unconcealed, something like that. The sense of the lightness of the unconcealed requires a prior intuition of something like the background dark from which it emerged, something like that. And that's kind of a new thought here. That's really, you're only getting it in his later analysis of Aletheia and with this structure of unconcealment business. And Heraclitus matters for him for that, because Heraclitus is, among other things, this thinker of the unity of opposites, this dialectical thinker of, in every relationship between an A and a B that are supposed to be exactly contrasted with one another, there's something they have in common that's the axis upon which they are oriented, or something like that. And the concealment unconcealment axis is something like the appearing of truth. It's what they have in common. The appearing of truth is the axis along with the notion of concealment and the notion of unconcealment ride, so to speak. So that's the other accent he's trying to get in this lighting idea. And I think he's right to see a bunch of that in Heraclitus and to see it in his notion of the not setting ever. On the very next page, he also throws in the extra twist about the difference between the Dasein or mind-light things, which are different from other lit things, lit up things, revealed things, because they're not just lit up, they're a light. But there's something about the mind or consciousness or place or site where being happens, whatever you want to call it, that is the illuminating, not just the illuminated. And participating in the structure of the illuminating is the extra thing he's talking about here.
But a lot of this would depend on us agreeing with the way the fragment 123 is looked at, which I do, but I mean, I could be wrong about that. I think that it's sort of that starts us on the path and he kind of culminates at page 119.
So yes, this is definitely interpretation of that fragment. There's other fragments in Heraclitus it's also interpretations of. I mean, you can tile this back to a view of Heraclitus's sort of overall cosmology, and not just cosmology in the sense of cosmology without mind in it, but cosmology with mind in it. So not a purely naturalistic cosmology. And I think it fits with that. How much does it fit with Heidegger's own, how much is the rest of Heraclitus's view fit with Heidegger's own open question. But what's the point? This is a kind of thinking about these things that is usually considered, Heidegger himself and also the places will say this is the Greeks thinking metaphysically, right? But here he is not using thinking metaphysically as a term of denunciation, as though that they've reified the act that should be left as the active verb that it is. Instead, he's basically saying, oh, actually, Heraclitus basically got this, right? He basically got this right from Heidegger's own point of view. And you don't see the attitude you see in, say, the Nietzsche lectures of the history of Western metaphysics is the history of the obscuring of being, right? The end of the whole essay says, Heraclitus thinks toward the event of the lighting, right? And that's the opposite of not being able to see that, right? So he's his own standard of what counts as, put it this way, illuminated thinking is fully met by the interpretation of Heraclitus he gives here. I don't see there as being as much difference between that and what he is often inclined to denounce as metaphysical thinking. I think it is metaphysical thinking, but I don't think it's a bad thing. But that's my own gloss on this. But these are all great things to bring up. We're getting, maybe deep into the substance stuff, which is fine. I mean, that's what it's for first reactions. I want to give, sorry, we have Darlene just joined us. Darlene, you may not know the format where we typically ask if people are able to do the reading and go around and ask for first reactions. We've been able to do that with the others. Do you want to jump in and give us your first reaction to the readings, or were you able to do the reading and so on?
I'm new to your group and I'm new to philosophy in general. I'm just listening today.
That's fine. Okay, thanks. All right. So if you don't know, this is the book we're reading right now. It's called Early Greek Thinking by Heidegger. We're reading the section on the last fragment, like the last 20 pages of this book, which is a fragment from Heraclitus that Heidegger is interpreting. Which normally is read, "How can one hide himself before that which never sets?" Which is a single line in Heraclitus that we're spinning out to 20 pages here. But okay, so that's where we're at. So before we get into like structure of the essay stuff, explication of all that, I want to go through the actual words of the Greek of our actual original. He does give you a translation of each piece of it. By the end, he's suggesting various differences along the way for each, which can get complicated. I want to just start off by letting anyone ask about any parts of it they don't actually get, or how Heidegger is reading them. The actual words in Greek are these. This is tome, dunon, pote, hos entis, lathoi. Okay. So what is this me donon pote, right? The pote is ever. It's sometimes put together with the me in front to make never, but pote just means ever. It does not quite always, but ever. The me in front of it, that's the me, the me. It's what's one of the little unvoiced e's, that thing that looks like a y with the accent. That's one of the two main privatives in Greek. Well, privatives, negatives in Greek. You can say ok, which means not, and you can say me, which is more like un. It's still often translated not, but when we say untruth, we're saying me in front of something, saying unbeing. But it's not as hard a negation as ok, is what I'm trying to say. The ouk. So the me on is the not quite fully being, for example, in Plato. So it's that me negative in front of this word for setting, to set. And Heidegger makes much of the fact that to set is to go into concealment, right? So it's on the same axis, he claims, as the lathoi at the end of the line. But it's what the sun does every night, right? It sets, right? It's what happens when something is obscured by clouds. It goes behind the clouds. To be obscured by what's in front of it, to go down behind something is this dunon. So literally translated would be not setting ever, right? So the not setting ever. That's the thing, which in the translation is put off at the end of the line. That which never sets is put off at the end of the line, but it's actually at the beginning of the line in the Greek, right? So, and then the post is before. That's the POS, just like as in position. That's the before. And then and tis makes this a who. It's not a what. And the lathoi is this middle voice we were talking about. Something that one does to oneself as both the subject and the object of the action. So in the middle voice, hide. And so lathoi, that's the concealment, but it's the hide version of concealment. To remain concealed, to conceal oneself, to remain concealed as oneself. This lathoi is the middle voice of to hide. So that's why it's being translated as before post, that which never sets, me denan potes. And then the tis is a who, right? It can't be a what that's doing the hiding. So how can some not an object but an agent, lathoi, hide himself? So how can he hide before what never sets? And there's a definite meant to be a paradoxical feel to the sentence in the Greek, right? It's using never set on the one hand and hiding on the other, and so it's meant to be a jarring contrast that if it's a never set, you couldn't hide before it. But it's phrased in the form of a question. Somehow some manage to hide from what never sets. There is some never setting truth, being, existence, whatever, that is that some manage to somehow hide themselves before, right? Okay, so that's the sort of just basic sense of the Greek. You can read more philosophical stuff into it, and he certainly will, but I just wanted to make sure that each of the actual words that are appearing here that get played with are plain or apparent to people. Are there any questions about any of that, about just the Greek terms and what they each mean? So far, no. This not setting ever. Go ahead.
So just one thing I'd point out is that, so this lathoi, we in English say he has hide himself.
Mm-hmm.
And we have this word self that we have to put in there. And the Greek doesn't have that self in it.
Correct.
And
the Greek,
like,
absolutely right. The Greek just has a who and a middle voice. The middle voice does all the work of what we would say is the self-reference in English or a later Romance language. They would have to recreate the middle voice kind of construction by saying, does this to himself. In French, you would put an SE in front of something or an S apostrophe in front of something. You know, to myself, I do this, right? The same kind of construction you would do in French as a you know, simple or whatever, you know, societe, whatever, I sit myself down, right? Where you would put an SE in front of it to have this self-reference. There's none of that in Greek. You just use the middle voice.
Right. So we can even say, like, I wash my hands, and I got the hands are there an object, but I don't have to say I myself wash my hands. So we can use that or not use it in English.
For some things we can. Whitman, he says, do I contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict myself, right? So then he goes on to say, I am large, right? So, but the point is, when you're talking about contradicting yourself, you have to include the self that's doing the contradicting, right? Or you don't get the sense. And in some of these middle voice things, it's a little bit like that. The thing hidden, the thing doing the hiding have to be the same thing for the middle voice to work. And it's not just a doing, it's a transpiring. The being hidden occurs. It's not simply undergone passively, it's not a passive voice, but the being hidden is also not just something that I actively decided to do and do, right, to something else. there's no transitive aspect of it. It's a self-moving.
Like you can contradict yourself, or you could be in contradiction.
Yes, 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 and the languages without the middle voice usually try to deal with this either by saying, putting an extra self in there, or by turning the phrase around, or by saying it both ways, or something like that, in order to get some of the same sense. But you get it, like there's tons of philosophical thinking, I think especially in German, that is all about playing with subject and object distinctions, which will still be all about these sort of self-referential things. Think of Hegel and Fichte and these sorts of people, right? They're always talking about is and of itself and all this kind of thing, right? They're putting all of these extra prepositions around the thing to do what the middle voice does to you for free in Greek.
But of course they'd be doing it because they've just invented the self in the German Enlightenment sense of it.
Certainly in Fichte's case, he thinks he's defining it, right? But as something like the subject of wisdom or something like that. But by the time you get to Hegel, he does think that there's something like an ongoing appearing of the absolute spirit to itself or something like that. If the absolute spirit is appearing to itself, it's not just something that I'm doing, right? It's something I'm participating in as a fragment of the spirit that is a piece of the absolute spirit, something like that. So there's this, there are these middle voice kind of notions in some of the other philosophers that do usually think in this dialectical subject and object way. In Greek, you don't have to be dialectical about it. You don't have to be back and forth about it. You can just say it in the middle voice, and you're saying, this happens to me, I undergo this transpires with myself, right? I am veiled before what never sets, right? Okay, so that's just the peculiarities of the language, and he does bring this out with examples from Homer and so on, about Odysseus remaining hidden, right, before the others, and the remaining hidden before the others is not that the other people don't notice him, definitely. It's and Heidegger's right. There's like a cloak around Odysseus that no one else can see through. The concealment cloak is around him so that others don't notice and pass by. But the not noticing and passing by is not something they're doing. It's something which around him makes it not possible for him to be seen, right? And I want to point out, I think I've mentioned this in one of our previous discussions. We were talking about Aletheia in this Lathoi, right? The thoi, the th, etc. at the end of that is very close to the same in the other inflected forms of it. It's exactly the same as the roots of all their words for seeing in the sense of theater, right? And the Lathoi is something like the unseen. So the hidden here is something like remaining unseen. So there's already something of a not seeable in concealment itself, right? We have many of the same kind of constructions in English. We talk about truth as discovery, where you're dissing something which is a covered, and the covered is a CO in front of something, right? So something, and you had to CO cover it, and then you had to diss the CO to uncover it, right? But we have many of those kinds of constructions about words for discovery, appearance, and truth in other languages too. It's definitely there in the Greek that this aletheia is a privative of lethe, which is a kind of forgetting, but it's a remaining unseen, which is a can't be or an un kind of modifier in front of the realm of the seen, right? So lethe is the unseen world. And it doesn't mean unseen world just in the sense of nobody looked at it, but it does not have the attribute that it is capable of being seen, something like that, as one of its potential powers or characteristics, without getting into anything about essences. It is unseeable. Jim, question.
Is that what became terra incognita for Latin? Because it's the unseen, same thing.
Well, incognita means unknown, literally, right? But unknown is not quite the same thing as this unseen as unseeable. Lethe has more of a connotation of oblivion than incognita does. Incognita, you just haven't been there yet, and as soon as you get there, you're going to cognita it.
Right,
and
but the terra incognita is like a world that you discover, or a realm. So I'm wondering if there's a connection with the realm.
It's a land, but I mean, terra is earth or land. But there isn't in the word Lethe itself a notion of realm. People will talk about the realm of Lethe, or the plains of Lethe, or the river of Lethe. They'll add all these poetic things onto it to turn the operator into a realm, and that's exactly what metaphysical thinking is. It's taking the thought of the concept-like operator or accent that somebody could have and turning it into a place, and turning it into a thing that you can think about as a thing or a place that you can navigate to and grasp like a noun. But the Lethe itself is just the unseen.
Right. So if Lethe is more like for oblivion or unseen, but Alethis, is that it's closely related?
Aletheia is
yes.
the not unseen. It's the not unseen. It's the discovered, the unconcealed, the coming forth from concealment into unconcealment, and that's their word for truth.
Yeah, and that's so subtle. For me, it's hard to get the difference.
Sure.
There's a lot of nuance there. So
yes, okay. But I mean, one of the things which is poetically going on here, and in the Greek itself, and Heidegger is playing on this a bit, but maybe not accenting as much as you could as a poet, is these things are being related to, if I can put it this way, narratively and biographically, not just as concepts about external things in the world by disembodied reasoning philosophers, right? The Lethe are the dead, right? The ones walking around are living in the light of the sun. Those that are in the light of the sun are those that are alive, and those who have passed away into oblivion are those who have gone down across the plains of Lethe into the unseen, right? That's the poetic afterlife that's there in all of the Greek understanding of these words, right? So Lethe is a word for the concealed, but also a word for oblivion, a word for forgetting, and a word for death, right? And all of those are something which people experience, narratively and biographically in their life as, a before out of which things can arise, but also what they return to, right? And the living are the time in the sun, something like that. And that's why this the never setting is a important concept here. There's the realm of the light that remains, which is a kind of polar opposite of the realm of Lethe, or the realm of oblivion, right? It's the realm of the always shining true that doesn't set, that doesn't have the mortality that Lethe has attached to it. So the not setting ever as a word for the shining appearing true is a polar opposite of the Lethe of oblivion. And as he gets to later, some of the words that get used for that are words that are also words for life, right? So narratively, truth and oblivion and life and death get mapped to each other. So I don't know if that helps, but all those poetic connotations are there in the words. In the Greek, they tie to their myths, but they also tie to the emotional feel of the words. Dan?
Yeah, related to this, like Heidegger always said that this first beginning was only possible in Greek, and because of the Greek language, like what you said, like this passive voice and all this mythology and all this like multiple meanings to like Lethe and Aletheia and like later Heidegger thought the German is the second one that may make the second beginning possible. And again, he's not because like thought some racist stuff or whatever. It was this kind of like highly mythical, and the language is so flexible and makes this possible to create new meanings out of its structure, and flexible enough to allow new things. And like a person who came to language, like to English, for example, late in my life, like for example, English is very pragmatic. It's a business oriented. It's a pragmatic language. It's logical. It's stuff like that. It limits one to see the world in a certain way, and it's very difficult to think something like rethink Heidegger in English. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's probably plenty of truth to that. I will say that many of these sort of shifting word meanings with this sort of depth of poetic nuance to them, you also find in, people who study, the Indo-European languages generally, things like Sanskrit, and ways in which the words transform into each other across these language families. And people find the same kind of this way, poetic and emotional depth in Old English, and which sometimes goes back to German, of course. The temporally deeper aspects of language always have some of this intuitive mythological thinking layer to them, where the poetic connotations of the words are being used, and they tend to wear thinner to a pragmatic, threadbare current meaning in use for surface things. But the more they've been used for something like poetry, philosophy, religious thinking, anything of that nature, the more they can still have that weight coming from those sort of all the original depth of meaning of the words. And I think that's partly just an aspect of time. It's an aspect of the temporal depth of the language. The things which are farther back seem to more readily touch on these fundamental aspects of, I'm going to put it this way, narrative aspects of the life world. So they wind up touching these points of emotional resonance, right? They got into language that way and early for a reason, right? They were important to people, and they set up some of the not only just the poles of distinction, but the poles of emotional weight, emotional freight to words that the rest of the language and uses of it formed around, right? And he makes solutions to that in a few places here. I think, by the way, in the later parts of this essay, he is playing with some of the correspondences of some of these things between the Greek and the German. I don't know if people noticed this. When he got to the part about the life aspect, this is on page 116. He gets into he has a little reference to Nietzsche. How can something dead be being? We have no other word for life. And then he goes to the Greek. It's funny that the Greek word for life that he uses here first is Zen, right? If you transliterate it, but Zen or Zoa, right? And he's saying it has this primitive za that you put in front of things, and this za that you put in front of things, he says, at first appearances, it just looks like an intensifier, but it's not an intensifier. The za in front of things is putting living in front of things, right? So you're saying it's not most divine, but living God, not very forceful, but living anger, not most fiery, but living flame, right? Those constructions in English of the living X, scare the living daylights out of you, right? We say, right? That's the same construction that you're getting here in the Greek. That if you put a za in front of something, you're saying the living that, and that becomes an intensifier. But that preface za, right, in front of things is the same thing that is our zoo in zoology, our Zoe, right? Zoe and zoology and zoo this and zoo that is the same zoo or za root word. It starts off as a little eta, and then it sort of bifurcates into a hard epsilon on one side as a ze, and into a softer o, omicron on the other side as zo. Zo goes off and becomes zoology and life, what happens to the Z epsilon that becomes sorry, Z eta that becomes Z epsilon? Well, it's the first two letters of the name of Zeus, right? So and in Indo-European words being passed around from one language to another, Z's become D's. That's why, you know, Zeus becomes Deus, right? What happens if you do that Z to D translation instead of from into Latin to get a D into German? Za becomes Da. So one reading of Dasein might be to a Greek living being, right? He would hear that DA and Dasein as not as a German there, but as a Greek living, as an intensifier of being, the being that's really alive, the living being. And that's how a Greek ear would hear the Da and Dasein. And I think he's playing with that. He does not try to make that connection directly, but when he's bringing up this this life intensifier thing, he's steering towards the fact that Heraclitus himself talks about ever-living fire as his explanation of the cosmos, and he wants to turn that he wants to line up that ever-living fire with the notion of lighting. But the point is that the life through which that connection is being made, in passing, leaving a few steps out, he connected up with German Da, if you were paying attention. I don't know if anybody else noticed or caught that, but okay. And one way to think about this is that when the Greeks put Za in front of things to say that they were alive, it wasn't that their primitive sense was from biology and they were all biologists and they were trying to say that a living flame was flame that had grass in it, right? What they're trying to say is that grass is some of that crazy stuff that's got God inside of it because it's alive, right? They're trying to say there's something in life which has this being in some superlative sense, some more being in it that is the arising, appearing being, that is the living being, and that living being is the divine spark in the living thing, right? So the fact that things which are living differ from things which are not living in seeming to have this magical divinity to them is what this Za preface in Greek. It's why it splits into both having these references to the godly and this use as an identifier and the living X and the living Y on the one hand, and turns into just the word for how grass is different from rocks, right? So anyway, and I think he's right to relate this back up to the when he talks about the ever-living. He says Nietzsche too in one of his notes says, being we have no conception of it other than life, how can something dead be? And the issue there is not that we cannot imagine a being we ascribe to a rock. What Nietzsche is claiming is that our internal intuitive, viewed from inside sense of things is that what when we think of being in general, we are projecting our own sense of our own being into things. And our own sense of our own being is our being alive, right? So there is a transference of our self sense, our being alive self sense. This is what Nietzsche is getting at, to what it means for something to truly be in some sense, and that's what he's getting at there when he says, "How can something dead be?" There's no logical problem with seeing something dead being if you're a logic chopper, but there is a problem with intuitively thinking of that as being if your sense of being is coming from your internal intuitive sense that you have of it as the thing that you are doing, right? You can't think of yourself as only doing what the stone does, right? It's not intuitively accessible to think of yourself as a stone. Anyway, that's the point of these passages on 116, I think, and the way in which I would line up the Nietzsche reference to why he's bringing in life at all, and these other connections. Anyway, I'm triggered on all that just by what Dan said about the stuff which is there in the language in the Greek or the German, and that's going back to sort of, if I can put it this way, the poetic pre-philosophical metaphysics that's already there in the language, right? And that the philosophers are themselves reacting to and exploiting to get their thoughts across, right? As well as perhaps steering their thought and shaping their thought to a degree. Anyway, so questions about any of that or other people's thoughts on those sections?
So why is he bringing up life as different from dead things like stones, if he's also going to say that animals don't have, self-revealing, self-concealing?
Yes, I mean, you're right that he does say that, but it's not the Greek thought about it. The Greeks were not saying that about animals. He's saying that about animals. The Greeks are saying that that's true even of grass, right? The Greek notion is that there's something divine even in the grass, and he doesn't. The Greeks are not tying it to the possession of language as the thing which allows this this sense of connection to an arising appearing of logos or something. I think that Heidegger is trying to tie it together to something like language is the place where this can happen, but that's him. That's not coming from the Greek originals, in my opinion. The Greek language isn't committed to the idea that only things with speech are alive in this sense.
Yeah, so they call out man as the zoon with the
yes, zoon, logon, and politikon. Yes,
but are they? So did the Greeks think so in terms of physis? Are they saying that things also appear presence to animals, for example? So they're not distinguishing. So to the Greeks, to Heidegger, things only presence to Dasein.
mm-hmm.
But is he saying here that to the Greeks, things presenced to everything that was alive?
He's not saying either way on it. What I'm saying is that the words that the Greeks use for life do not separate that off. Heraclitus might, but it would be a later philosopher on the point. It wouldn't be what's just there in the Greek language itself. What's there in the Greek language itself distinguishes the living from the not living by saying that there's some spark of the divine in everything alive, and not by saying there's only spark of divinity in gods and mortals who are by their nature a light, and because they have language as a house of being in which the meaning of being can appear. There's none of that in the Greek language itself, right? Sorry, I think with Dan first, then Jim. Dan.
In a different book, Heidegger makes an argument that the word being, the Greek word for beings, is the same word that the Greeks would use for whatever is in their reach, like in their household, whatever they have control over. And that's kind of, Heidegger makes the point that that's kind of like it's not just management and control, but it's constant presence. And that's
Sure.
that's they took it from their day-to-day experience, and for things that they have a grip, and they have, like, every day they can grab them and do something with them. And it's
so this stuff about praxis, right, is already there in like basic problems and being in time. The stuff about the experiencing the presence of what is presence, etc. We'll get to by the end of this one that we're doing next. But the point that Pete was getting at was, what view does Heidegger ascribe to the Greeks in general, or Heraclitus specifically, about where the appearing to happens, right? Not the things that can appear. The things that can appear may be the things that are present. The things which are living are a specific difference in the things which are present. There's something special about them, but it could be a special again that things can appear to, right? Besides that the thing is alive. And certainly by the later not scholastics, by the later Socratics, right? You get all these distinctions made as layers, right? There's the dead being, and there's the living being, and then there's the animal being, which is can move itself in Aristotle, and then there's the the thing with mind or spirit that can understand, right? And those are different levels, but that articulation of those different levels is a later philosophical thing. It's not something which is there already in the meaning of the Greek words themselves. From Heidegger's point of view, they've already reified the mind by the time they're doing that. They've already moved a little bit away from thinking of place or site or appropriating event of where being appears, something like that, into more like thinking of minds as objects like other things outside that they have to differentiate from other objects thought of as things outside. So the later philosophy has this exteriorization of the thinking things that it makes distinctions about. I don't think that Heidegger sees that any of that as being baked back into the original language, and at least here he's claiming that he doesn't see that in Heraclitus himself either. He's saying that Heraclitus's notion of the lighting, or the region of the lighting, is something which is like his own notion of Dasein, is prior to any of this objectifying of minds business, and is seeing think of it this way, a kind of unified place for the appearing to and the things appearing, right? The things appearing and the appearing to are both happening as one event of the living lighting of the world. Now, you could make an argument, plenty of people have, that Heraclitus is, has this pantheistic aspect to him, and that he's someone who is, seeing soul in all things, right? That's why he has an ever-living fire as the base of things. The fire aspect of it is not a material fire; it's a living fire aspect of things. So in that sense, there's certainly lots of people like the Stoics after Heraclitus that took him in that vein, and they would not see these later towers of distinctions among all these things back in Heraclitus. They would say, from their point of view, Heraclitus is someone who is seeing something like living and soul in all things, and they're agreeing with that, right? In the case of the Stoics, right? But okay, so my point is there's multiple possible interpretations of Heraclitus. Heidegger's reading of Heraclitus here is that he has seen and agreed with this lighting up of truth, place or site business that Heidegger, is ascribing to gods and mortals, but gods and mortals only, and not animals or plants. Jim?
Well, yeah, my question was kind of along the lines of what Pete was trying to get at, or about with animals, and it's like they have a unique way of revealing and concealing, because they don't speak. So without the speaking abilities, isn't that kind of what? But doesn't mean they're not alive. It just makes a distinction, or
right. But my point is that distinction is here made by Heidegger. It's not what you're seeing from Heraclitus himself.
Okay.
From Heraclitus himself, you'll see more of an assimilation of the less reasoning people to the asses of the field.
Yeah, right. The ass doesn't want gold; it wants hay.
Yes, which we'll come to, right? But the other things that he will say is, there is only one logos common to all, right? But the many act as though they had a private mind, right? So the point is, Heraclitus is appealing to a commonness of truth that is universally shared, and what he's seeing in mortals who delude themselves, so to speak, is that they are seceding from that common into a private mind, and he likens this to them acting like they're asleep. The people dream separately, but when they're awake, they live in one world together. And people who do not pay attention to the common and to the logos and to the truth that they share are seceding into their dream world, right? So the image is of separate sleepers who divide themselves off from the common when they sleep. And that is a kind of receding into a kind of oblivion. The sleepers are going to a separate realm of Lethe rather than sharing in the open common that is the common light of the world, of the bright shared thing of truth, right? So his notion is that the truth is something which is shared in common, and that's not quite the same as this, not even quite the same. That doesn't look to me like it's the same thing as the, if we can put it this way, the subjective, because before subject and object distinction component of what Heidegger is getting at, right? Because to Heraclitus, things are first in the truth, and they have to secede into a separated oblivion by acting as though they have a private mind, which is something like going asleep, falling asleep. But when I'm saying this, I'm relating this to other fragments of Heraclitus that he's not bringing up here. So it's not entirely fair. He's not trying to interpret those ones at the same time. But there are those other famous sayings of Heraclitus. We should not act as though we are men asleep, and there is one truth common to all, but the many act as though they had a private mind, right? So he has this notion of truth as a common and a shared by all, but it's not even some people, it's most people who don't simply live there. They run from it and try to hide from it. And that's part of what's going on with this, how can they hide from what never sets, in my opinion, in that aphorism. The thing which never sets that people hide from is the common truth accessible to all. And what is the seceding from that? The seceding from that is the falling asleep with a private notion of truth, something like that. Jim, did you have a question or still reacting? You're on mute.
Relaxing.
Relaxing, okay.
I was listening.
Dan?
Yeah.
Oh, Dan's good. Okay.
But so with Heraclitus, if a shepherd's out with a flock of sheep and there's some lightning, there's an event of feces, both the shepherd and the sheep both feel or presence that feces that went on. Heraclitus is not going to make a distinction that only people who have language experience the lightning. The natural zoons also experience the same things.
Mostly true, but he also is going to assimilate what some of the unthinking animals do in how they pay attention to only of their immediate concerns and ignore the truth in which they are, with what less thinking people do when they act like men asleep, right? When he says asses prefer hay to gold, it's not, animal asses he's talking about, right? When he says, pigs wallow in the mire, he is not talking about, barnyard animals only, right? So and this is, there's a pungent misanthropic aspect of some of the things you get in Heraclitus. He thinks that everyone is capable and responsible for living in the light of the truth, living in the common and not seceding away from it. But when he wants to point out that in fact they do secede and ignore the common true and seem to be wrapped up in a world of their own, he likens that behavior to behavior he also sees in lower animals, less rational animals, right? And the fact that he reaches for analogies like that tells me that he does not have the highest opinion of the ability to live in the truth of your average ass or swine, right? So again, I don't think there's a fully developed theory of the animal consciousness in Heraclitus. It's more just a slur he can reach for, right? If he wants to say you're no more thoughtful than the animals that you exploit, something like that. But he's doing that to call people to something higher or better than that of which he thinks they are capable, right? They could live as though they weren't a man asleep. They could live in the light of the common truth accessible to all. Joe?
I think we've heard and seen this version many times with philosophers, because what you're seeing here is could be called the inauthentic person versus the authentic person that later showed up, I think, in the 19th and 20th century. And of course, the authentic people disapprove of those who cannot be authentic, the inauthentic ones, the common ploy. And this is an elitism of the intellectuals who say, hey, I see this stuff, and the cattle out there, my neighbors, can't see it, so I look down upon them. But we've seen it before.
Yes. So okay, so here are a couple of fragments, Heraclitus, that he's known for, independent of the one we're reading, right? Though this logos is true evermore, yet men are as unable to understand it when they hear it for the first time as before they had heard it at all. For there all things come to pass in accordance with this logos. Men seem as if they had no experience of these things. When they make a trial of words and deeds, such as I set forth, dividing each thing according to its kind and showing how it truly is. But other men know not what they are doing when awake, even as they forget what they do in their sleep. And then again, we must know and follow the common. Yet though my logos is common, the many live as if they had a wisdom of their own. Right. So there is an element of this, which is he's trying to appeal to a common truth that he thinks he can lay before people, and the question is, can they see it when it is shown to them? There are plenty of later people after Heraclitus in the ancient world that had a relatively unflattering view of Heraclitus on these points, both for his misanthropy and for his obscurity. It's like he's railing against people for not understanding things that he is saying when the things he is saying are very hard to follow. Aristotle has a couple of particular quips. Aristotle in particular had a relatively low, he had probably the lowest opinion of Heraclitus of all the later thinkers in this line. But he said that Heraclitus seemed to be more confident of things he merely believed than other people are of things they can actually prove. That was the first point. And the second point was when he formulates when he bases his whole metaphysics around the principle of non-contradiction as his first of all principles, he does so in explicit opposition to Heraclitus, who regards as mad for ascribing, something in its opposite to the same thing, right? Now, obviously, Heraclitus is doing that because he's making this dialectical point about how an axis of distinction has to share something in the two terms that it has as opposites. But Aristotle thought that he was just getting confused and contradicting himself, right? And he did not like that kind of dialectical thinking because it was so far from the clarity of the logic that Aristotle himself was steering toward. So the point is that some of these aspects of Heraclitus of appeal to an intuitive understanding, denounce those that don't have it, be willing to contradict yourself, but blame other people as being asleep if they don't see it the same way as you, right? There were plenty of people that reacted to all of that by saying, yes, he's obscure, but, it was not well thought of. It was not considered, the standard everyone else wanted to abide by. The other side of it, though, is charitably read, more charitably read than that, more charitably read than he may have, regarded people around him. People did recognize that there was a lot of, deep thought in Heraclitus, which I think that this essay manages to bring out. So those other, I'm going to put it away, less lovely aspects of Heraclitus are not the theme here, but it's important to know that they do exist and that there were something that other people at the time kind of reacted to. It's why Heraclitus didn't, sweep all before him, and there are plenty of Heracliteans since, down to Heidegger liking him here, or Nietzsche feeling him as the Greek philosopher to whom he had the most affinity. And Heraclitus has had an enormous influence and you can find elements of his dialectical thinking in Hegel and so on. But he is not an uncontroversial figure or position, right? Some people don't like this level of what they would see as obscurantism in their philosophers, right? I think that it's a little bit shallow to not go looking for the nuggets of wisdom that may be there because of those, I put it this way, superficial or wrapper problems, right? Those are, you can correct those. But anyway, the reason I brought up all this stuff is Heidegger bringing in the animal here is primarily because he's trying to relate all this to this Zoe notion, because he wants to get to what the heck does Heraclitus mean when he calls the world an ever-living fire, right? And he needs to get to the ever-living part. What is this ever-living business? And so he has to explain that. He has to explain what he means by living in the first place. And that's how the animal comes in, because it's something that is the ever-living fire has to have, and the souls of men or gods have to have. But the way the word is used, it's also something that every animal has. And so he brings in the animal that way. But it's not because Heraclitus brought in the animal when he brought up the ever-living fire, right? Heraclitus was not trying to make a comment on pigs and donkeys for us when he brought up the ever-living fire. He was trying to make a comment on something like the a rising appearing of the world, right? With the stuff that Heidegger gets to the end as, the ongoing arising appearing is how the world worlds, right? And that's something which for Heraclitus is there in physis. It's there in what we would call the physical as such. It's not even limited to the living. But that's not limited to is the wrong word for it, because for Heraclitus, everything has some aspect of this living to it, precisely because it is part of that arising appearing of things. The arising appearing of the physical from the background of non-existence, something like that, is already a sense in which the cosmos is alive in quotes, to Heraclitus. That's why he says this world, is now and always, will be an ever-living fire, not made by any man or god, and kindling in measures and going out in measures, right? That is his image of the ongoing event of the world. And the why fire, it's not fire as a material thing. Fire is more like something like the principle of energy or activity or life or liveliness in things, right? So that's what I take Heraclitus to be giving as his sort of fundamental cosmology there. And from the standpoint of moderns, that's both more materialistic than the people who make sharp distinctions between the living and the non-living, and it's way more animistic than the typical modern would be, or a typical materialist would be, right? So I find Heidegger is not simply agreeing with that worldview, but he is finding that there are things behind having that worldview, which to him, Heidegger, seem to correspond to reality, the event, our experience, something like that, so that he can understand the intuitions behind them, he can understand how the world appears that way, how the world feels that way, and that's part of how the world necessarily feels to us, right? He is sympathetic to that picture, which is not the same thing as signing off on it as a scientific theory of the cosmos. That's not what's going on at all, right? It's understanding that is the something like the ongoing event of truth or revelation of truth to us in which we participate. And that's what he finds appealing about Heraclitus's view of the world. Thoughts or comments on any of that? And come back to the final things he says about this. I mean, I'm thinking here of this stuff on 118. The event of lightning is the world. The meditatively gathering lightning which brings in the open is revealing truth. It abides in self-concealing. Self-concealing belongs to it as that which finds its essence in revealing, which therefore cannot ever be a mere going into concealment, never a setting. So he's trying to tie it back there to the world. Sorry, to the Aletheia. But the idea that the event of lightning is the world, I think that that's the point of direct contact between what Heraclitus is presenting as his worldview and Heidegger's own Dasein understanding of something like the event, right? There are definitely extra accents that Heidegger will have in his own understanding of these things, which you might not get there in Heraclitus. The idea of the seeing the lighting as the ongoing event of the world, something like that, as being something which is a being appropriated by the event on the part of the contemplating subject, of the contemplating mind. That's Heidegger. That's not Heraclitus. You don't find that in Heraclitus. Okay. There's a bunch of things I want to go back to, but first of all, any questions or comments on the stuff we've gone over so far? Otherwise, I want to get back all the way to the early stuff about Clement for a second. Did anyone else see what he did with the Clement stuff and have any reactions, or did it just seem all perfectly straightforward and
Oh, no.
okay, Jim, Clement,
I
go.
was going to say something. I thought that it didn't bother me that much that he was a little bit pejorative. What I actually think is I'm excited, and it shows that a lot of great thinkers actually try to engage with that text and try to give it understanding. You know, granted, he may have tried to like scrunch it into his worldview. You know, it's gonna fix it, but I don't think it's like a, you know, I don't think it was that bad. I don't think he mangled it to death to where, but I just think any great thinker, it doesn't matter what perspective they're coming from, they always try to deal with that. Like you said earlier, I thought was 16 other thinkers he had to remove to clear the way for his views. But I actually who was the other one? It was God, what was the other church father that mentions Heraclitus? Is it not Pliny the Younger? Who was it?
I mean, lots of them, but the one I can think of as mentioned the most would be,
you know,
would be Hippolytus.
Okay.
Mentions him quite a bit, but let's just talk about Clement for a second. So, I mean, people might not know even who Clement is, but Clement is like 2nd century church father who was a Platonist / Neoplatonist background. He was a teacher of Oregon. He's about a century before Plotinus and about a century after Epictetus, the Stoic. So sandwiched between Epictetus and Plotinus. But on the brand new Christian thinking side of things, he's in Alexandria. He writes some, you know, father stuff and polemics and so forth. But he also, you know, teaches Oregon Greek philosophy, right? In basically the same school that Plotinus learns those things, and Ammonius between Oregon and Plotinus, who was the actual teacher of Plotinus, who was a Greek philosopher primarily, but Christian persuasion, let's put it that way. So that means that Clement is coming out of a tradition where philosophy is Plato and the Stoics, but his you know, newly added to that religion is Christian, right? And here you see Heidegger sees Clement reading that how can he hide himself before that which never sets, as instantly seeing that which never sets must mean God, and hiding yourself before God is something like it's something which you obviously cannot do, but he says one can hide from the light of the senses, but it can't before the spiritual light. And Clement doesn't actually even say God there. He just says the spiritual light. So first point. And then to connect it to anything like the notion of being before God as being something which could dissuade one from sin, he says in this way alone a man will never fail if he holds the belief that God is everywhere present with him. what people might not know is that people will think of that, especially in this context with Heidegger putting it out that way, as a particularly Christian thought. But you can find it word for word practically in Epictetus, who's a pre-Christian Stoa. Well, he's not Christian. He's a Stoa, but about 100 years after the time of Christ. The point is that that thought was there in the Stoics, who were deists themselves, even if they weren't Christian, right? The notion that philosophers are one thing and religion is something else, and none of the philosophers were religious. This is not true. Right? Plenty of the ancient philosophers were religious, and you will find that exact reflection about holding yourself to be a son of the divine, or to have a divine spark in you, and that's the reason to not disgrace yourself and disgrace your high calling. Something like that is something you would find in the Stoa, right? So that aspect of this and that way of potentially reading what Heraclitus will be saying is something you wouldn't have to be a Christian to do, right? And you would find in the Stoa between, right? Does that mean that that this understanding of that which never sets is a fully adequate one? I don't think so. I think that Heidegger is fair in seeing there as being more in that concept than just its later reification, turning it into a noun, so to speak, right? It's trying to be more clinically precise. It's like when a mathematician gives you just a bit of the definition necessary for a theorem to go through, right? He's using the term with art, and that which never sets is what matters here, not what substantive you put on what you substitute for that which never sets. It's not a question of whether or not you substitute for that which never sets Plato's good or Christian God or cosmos or nature, right? All of those are possible substitutions that try to turn that which never sets into some one entity that you can ascribe all kinds of other characteristics to. But when Heraclitus is saying this, none of what he's saying depends upon any of those substitutions. He's not trying to bring in other attributes from some substituted thing. The only thing that's needed to make this thought go through is whatever it is that never sets, right? So in that sense, there's a philosophical exactness to using that formulation that you lose as soon as you try to substitute in something else, that it's going to wind up dragging in extra characteristics along with it, which are going to be foreign to the original thought here. So the part of this reaction with Clement that is kind of unfair on Heidegger's part is that there could be plenty of what Clement sees and says here that is not particular to Christianity. For the one part, it could be Stoic, and some of it might have actually agreed with some of the things that Heraclitus thought. The Stoics thought of Heraclitus as the father of their school of thought. For example, they thought that he was the original logos thinker, and they were all about one logos steering the whole kind of stuff that they thought they found in Heraclitus. Which maybe they did, maybe they didn't. Maybe they added their own things to him, but they thought of Heraclitus as the father of their school, right? They were trying to be Heracliteans, so they weren't trying to differ from Heraclitus, the Stoics I'm talking about. So in that way, Heidegger is a little bit unfair to Clement here. The part where he's fair, though, is if you're going to drag in extra meanings here from a substitution for the terms that the philosopher actually used, you are definitely going to put your own thought in there instead of his, right? He said that which never sets. He didn't say that which never set equals X, Y, or Z, and then reason about all the extra attributes you get because you chose Y, right? So that part of his criticism here is fair, in my opinion.
You'd say it would have been better for Clement to say something more like, they seem like they're correlative, right?
Yes, I mean, if he had said, you cannot hide from spiritual light, and this, and if he had just said, and this is an urge, and this is urging us to live in the light of the truth. If he had left it at that, that would have been a gloss or interpretation of what Heraclitus was saying here, that would have been fully in keeping with what Heraclitus actually said, and with what Clement actually believed, right? And that wouldn't have been dragging in his own extra stuff, right? It would have been staying fairly close, that is close and fair to what Heraclitus had actually said. That he goes beyond that to, in this way alone will a man never fall, right? There he might have been thinking of the Stoa as much as anything particularly Christian. But regardless of which he was thinking of, he was bringing in something else. He was bringing in an ethical content to this line. And that's, to be fair, because of the content of the actual place he's citing it. He's writing a book on pedagogy, right? He's writing a book for teachers about and so on. But and that's sort of why he's citing Heraclitus on this. But it's not simply Heraclitus at that point, right? It's a rhetorical use made of him or something like that. Because in this line itself, the how can he hide before that which never sets? It's not a it's not the moral admonition you find in Epictetus to keep yourself to a high and strict moral standards by always paying attention to what never sets, or something like that, right? The what is at stake in paying attention to what never sets is that you are living in truth and reality, right? It's not a a moral holding yourself pure kind of thing in that respect. So anyway, that would be a fairer way for Clement to have read Heraclitus on the one hand, or for Heidegger to have criticized him only for the thing he was specifically guilty of. I think that it's still fine. I mean, the other reason that Heidegger is bringing this up is just to show that it is dead easy for a later thinker to read his own concerns back into the previous one, etc. We have to ask ourselves, is Heidegger doing the same thing here, right? Is Heidegger's focus on the lighting as this event of the worlding of the world a reading of his own concerns back into Heraclitus? And does that distort the sort of actual kind of living pantheism cosmology that Heraclitus was probably actually getting at? Because I don't think Heidegger simply ascribes to that sort of cosmology, right? He's seeing a point of contact with it in this the lighting as this sphere of appearing of truth structure, something like that.
So why wouldn't he be glad that everyone shares in it? I mean, I get it perfect, but they're all starting from that place, and as time's go, I mean, thousands of years later, it's going to change a little bit, but they're all trying to get back to a central point from which to launch. I'd just be
and
happy.
It's, I mean, Clement is 700 years after Heraclitus, or 650, something like that. He's a long time after Heraclitus, right? Fair. But anyway, and does it, other people? I know that Craig, you brought this up with the voices and concerns about the distortion of later thinking. Do you see Heidegger doing with Heraclitus the things which he's accusing Clement of doing here, or how do you view this?
That's the major concern I've had all the way through the book, is how much of it is him overriding his own desire to push his own agenda, for lack of a better way to put it.
Mm-hmm.
How do we sort that out? And I'm not sure we can sort it out until sort of history decides for him, in some respects. But yeah, that's exactly the kind of concern is who's reading into whom, and what is their motivation for doing it.
So fair, but let's ask ourselves the other question. If Heidegger only hit upon a philosophical truth because he projected it into the mind of Heraclitus and it wasn't really there, but the thing he hit upon was actually philosophically true, would it matter if that's how he discovered it?
In that sense, probably not, as long as he could, in effect, that's what I was getting to, recontextualize it to our language, to our time frame, to our worldview, which is what you're alluding to with was it pantheism, was it the early Greeks, was it even language? Yes. That's the whole question, is how do we recontextualize what may have been a truth in Heraclitus to what we are doing now?
Yeah, but if the result is that we manage to arrive at a truth now, and it might not even be in terms of our worldview, it might shake up and change our worldview, right? But from my point of view, if Heraclitus is the prompt, I'm less concerned with the historical accuracy of his reading of Heraclitus than with whether or not what comes out of it is a philosophical thought that's deep and engaging enough that it sets me thinking about it for 6 months. right? If it manages to do that, you know, the prompt of Heraclitus's little aphorism did its job. Leave aside whether or not Heidegger did his, I don't need him to be the historian for me. I need him to be a philosopher for me. And that means that if Heraclitus goads him, he's got to go do that philosophy stuff and give us some good philosophy, right? And if he does, then, you know, he has performed the philosopher's work humanly well, something like that. And if in the process there was a mild historical injustice to the memory of, you know, how Heraclitus actually saw the world, we'll let the history professors sort that out 200 years from now. I mean, it's trivial in comparison to me.
Yeah, the other side is whether or not that that insight that we dig out of Heraclitus and start applying and seeing the new insight and start chewing on it now actually becomes supportive of Heidegger, or may actually be superseding Heidegger or finding him to
Sure.
be off track.
Absolutely, absolutely. And if our engagement with the problematic shows us places where we should agree with Heidegger and places where we shouldn't, all the better, because it's putting the right thing in charge, which is our independent engagement with the matter itself. Yeah, Dan.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm reading this book now, Against Method, and the argument there is that what Galileo did is nothing scientific. It was just pure propaganda, because otherwise there was no way for him to start the modern scientific method. And that everything, like his arguments were very, very, very thin and so on. And instead of showing that, he just used propaganda, and that's how the modernity started, with sciences and so on. So it's kind of
so I understand the argument you're making. This is, you're talking about the Against Method, but for your band, and I'm not terribly sympathetic to this position, right? Because as a description of what actually happened with Galileo, it may be accurate, but as a call to just engage in propaganda now in order to be effective, it's ruinous. If it were a cautionary tale about, you know, how Galileo didn't have all his, you know, ducks in a row, fine. But what it really seems to be is saying, and you can win as long as you have good propaganda, you know, regardless of how slipshod your arguments are. So go out there and win, right? And I think that that's a dangerously unsound encouragement that people don't need. They will do that too much on their own.
But you know, with Heidegger, I'm not saying he's doing propaganda, but his truths are so difficult to grasp. And probably, I don't know, I'm not advocating to do any propaganda, but it's like whatever Heraclitus said and Plato and Heidegger is saying, it's so difficult, and I don't know how to convince people there is something there, you know. But
well, Heraclitus apparently didn't either, because he just, you know, offered this as the common truth and said everybody should be able to understand it, and if you don't, then here's some abuse, right? And so, but nevertheless, the Stoics found a whole school of thought thinking that he was their predecessor. Sorry, Pete, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, and so, well, I think there's something special with Heidegger. He's not just coming up with the latest of a series of interpretations of Heraclitus, and in the sense that Clement might have come up with a new interpretation, and he would have thought this is the one that explains what Heraclitus said, aligned with Christianity. And you know, we finally have this is it. And then maybe St. Augustine would have had his interpretation, if not directly Heraclitus, maybe of Aristotle, and said, this is the final one. And then Aquinas. Whereas Heidegger is saying, oh, they all had their different interpretations, and that's because they're in a different time and place. And of course,
yes, but obviously, I understand what you're making, Peter. But obviously, plenty of people before Heidegger in the tradition have had that same attitude and made that same argument. It's not, he's not the first one to say that all these things are, you know, as it appears to them in their time and place and that sort of thing, right? That's not. Sorry.
But no, he's now doing something new, which is to say, given that I can look back and see that there's all these different interpretations. Now Heidegger makes his move and says, what would have to be true for all these interpretations to work for these different people?
Well, all the work in that just statement was done by the little word work, right? So if you pardon the expression, right? So first of all, I mean, someone like Clement is not purporting to be giving the final interpretation of the meaning of Heraclitus. And from his point of view, if Heraclitus agrees with some insights that Clement, independently thinks are true for the Plato or the Stoa or Christianity, so much the better for Heraclitus. And if he doesn't, so much the worse for Heraclitus, right? He doesn't think that the truth depends upon whether Heraclitus agrees with it. And the same you'll get with the later church fathers. They're, a Hippolytus will say, this is what Heidegger thought, but since, not Heidegger, this is what Heraclitus thought, but since it doesn't agree with the truth, it's just wrong, right? And that's the much more common move in tradition than that I have the final interpretation of this earlier thinker that shows all the ways in which he is true, right?
But all these Christians don't just think they have the final interpretation. They think that they have the grace of God that allows them to, there's some revelation there. They're not just intellectual.
Yes, but they also vary in their amount of humility about that subject. There's more variety in it than you're letting on. Is what I'm trying to get at. And so like the Stoa, for example, will say they think they have the final interpretation of Heraclitus, which shows how it agrees with their doctrine of the world logos and so on, and they are trying to cite him as the forerunner of their position and give a definitive final. This is what Heraclitus meant, and and it also agrees with the truth that we believe. But that's rare. It's rare that people have that relationship to an earlier thinker, that what their claim is about him is that they have interpreted him correctly as being in agreement with the final truth which they possess. Most people are not nearly that charitable to a previous thinker.
Maybe not to the previous thinker, but
any previous thinker is what I'm saying.
Convinced they had their understanding of being is now the correct one, and I'm pretty convinced that Aquinas thought substance. Yeah, this is what
I think that this is a caricature. I think that plenty of previous philosophy, right, had its own modes for this a degree of humility or skepticism. The skeptics certainly did, and Socrates had a Socratic doubt, and there's any number. Kant has his criticism against dogmatic philosophy, right, and so on, right. And there's lots of ways in which previous thinkers have performed the move of relativizing the impact or scope of previous philosophical positions, which don't have to reduce to dismissing them, but which all in the end do dismiss them, right? They may learn from them, but they learn from them in order to assimilate them and assimilate them into the truth which the thinker now is presenting to you. And that is true of Heidegger himself. Yes, Heidegger is saying these may be intimations which can lead someone to, a greater understanding of what the call is from the event on thinking as a vocation or something like that. But it's the call from the event to thinking as a vocation, right? And it's that's the thing to be listened to, and that's Heidegger's own insight, right? And he's not expecting that to change next week when someone else gets another call from the event, right? The only question is, will there be anyone taking the event's calls, right? But even given the fact that he has his own moves of relative respect for the previous thinkers, there is nothing exceptional in the fact that he regards himself as giving the correct interpretation of what they contributed or didn't contribute for the correct next step for thinking or the next way forward. Heidegger has that ambition for his own thought. And I don't think there's any decided difference in that regard. Nietzsche is way more relativistic than Heidegger, but he still presents his some aspects of his thought as being a final noon of human history and so on, right?
Right, but so Heidegger does make the same mistake as everybody else, it seems, to think that him and his time, this is it. This is the special time with a special insight. And he thought in the 1930s that, this was the moment, the revolution, where the new truth would come out and stuff. So he's swept up just like everybody else in thinking that there's something special about his time and his language. But at the same time,
but two things, right? First of all, you're sure that that's a mistake. First of all, right? But second, let's be less sure that that's a mistake. But then secondly, it's not like avoiding that mistake gets you anywhere if you don't actually stick your neck out and engage with the actual problems, right? The reason that what he does is valuable is because he's not trying to immunize his position against future refutation by claiming that it incorporates all the subsequent refutations by leaving a door open for them. That does not help. If you don't tell me something I didn't already know about the orderly of the world and the structure of life world or whatever, and the event and so on, you're not helping me. And if you say everything I tell you could be superseded next week, you haven't told me anything I didn't already know.
Right. So the stuff, let's say he thought in the 30s that, the German language has a special relationship to being and stuff. He's caught up in his own time and place. And I'm not German. I think that's complete rubbish.
Sure.
And Kant had similar things, and all these other people thought that they were in a special place. But what Heidegger does that's special is, while he has his own views about his own specialness, at the same time, he's figured this thing out, the clearing Ereignis, that he's saying applies to him and everybody else who thought that they were in a special place.
But every systematic philosophical thinker does this, right? Nietzsche gives you an explanation that Hegel fits inside. Hegel gets you an explanation that Dionysius the Areopagite fits inside. Plato gives you an explanation that Parmenides and Heraclitus fit inside, right? Every systematic thinker does that. And Heidegger has not given some systematic form of thought that leaves the ticket in sort of place for all the future thought, only for the past ones, right? So that's an accomplishment they're all capable of, right?
I think there's something a little more special than all of them in that some of them are like epochal, and so we can say
that's fair. I mean, what I would say,
Descartes is epochal in that then Newton and Leibniz and possibly the German idealists all fit inside the Cartesian subject object. So there's like a different ontologies, and
right, but I mean, there's no different from my point of view. I understand what you're saying, but from my point of view, that is no different from saying that there's a particular chapter of the phenomenology of spirit in which each previous philosophy fits, right? But it's the same kind of, any system can do this. But where I'm going to partly agree with you, though, is that the extra thing, which I do think Heidegger does, is try to explain some of these historical structures that he finds beneath the history of Western philosophy specifically, that he thinks are ongoing patterns that they're playing out or fulfilling or running through the changes of. That to me does not make it something final or distinctive, but it is an actual achievement, accomplishment, contribution to have noticed and pointed to those things out, right? It is a concrete result to see the pattern, the common pattern in the different eras of Western metaphysics, like he does in the Nietzsche lectures, for example, and to trace out the different moments that must be filled out in that structure. That's, it's a kind of philosophical structuralism that he, discovers, invents, whatever. And there's no question that that's a positive contribution to understanding the past of human thought, something like that, right? I just don't see there as being anything definitive or final in that. I think that every good philosopher makes contributions of that kind.
Right. I'm not saying it's the final one.
Right.
But what I think he's more special than every other philosopher in the sense that, let's say, Baudrillard, Deleuze, Derrida, Foucault, existentialism can all fit in this new world that he came up with.
If you
So
think
he's like a 500-year philosopher.
if you think that there isn't a Hegelian in the world who thinks he can do the same with all those same philosophers and
They're wrong. They're caught in metaphysics.
Perhaps true, but it doesn't mean that they do not have a system in which they can do that, right? That's
true.
the ability.
Marx has that.
Absolutely.
Marx can explain everything
Absolutely.
within Marxism.
My point, right? That's my point. Every systematic philosopher makes this claim, and many of them can do it, but it's not always a virtue that they can. Sometimes it's a sign of the rigidity of their own thought, rather than an accomplishment on their part, right? The things which I find distinctive and engaging in Heidegger in this respect is not that he, can create a system like that has, historical categories for ticketing and sorting past philosophies into it. It's that when I see him actually engaging with one of these past philosophies that's deep and he's, at the coal face facing that philosopher's thought, he's actually fair to them and he's not just trying to pigeonhole them into a place in his system.
He's actually thinking. He's not.
Yes. And
just ideologically interpreting.
Yes, the easiest thing would be to turn that person into a place in my system and stick him in the pigeonhole he fits in, so that he doesn't disrupt the flow of the system conquering things. And that's what he doesn't do, right? Instead, he, if he thinks that Heraclitus has this thought of the event, but thinks of it as the lighting rather than the event, he'll see the point of contact and try to bring it out, even though, if we've been paying attention, it completely contradicts his previous thesis that the Greek couldn't see these things. Right, because he's admitting that they do and did, right? But so much the worse for his previous claim and its systematizing nature, and so much the better for his actual honesty and charity as a philosopher engaging with Heraclitus and seeing what he thought, right? So it's that aspect of Heidegger that to me is more praiseworthy and more distinctive. It's the depth in which his direct engagement with the previous thinker is problematic, brings out the non-systematizing, charity in him, the non-systematizing fairness in him, that he is actually trying to see what the previous thinker thought, and if it's upsetting to his previous, historical schema for ticketing and sorting all previous opponents, so much the worse for that schema, right? Rather than the other way around. That's the thing that to me makes him not one of these systematizing ideology constructors, but someone who's like, he has that honest philosopher's wonder that you also find, in my opinion, in people like Plato and Socrates and so on. Dan?
Yeah, and I agree what you said, that it's also great, like every time he encounters, like, for example, Plato, especially Kant, and then Nietzsche, he changes his philosophy. Almost it's kind of presents everything completely different, and it's not just a system that stays the same, it's a system that changes. And I also I appreciated that in Heidegger. Like the other ones that you mentioned, that their system stayed the same pretty much.
Yes,
regardless of what they
the others may have a period when they're growing until they've assimilated everything, and then they just stop growing, and they just are dispensing their brickbats to the previous thinkers. And Heidegger seems to keep growing. There may be a time when that stops. I don't know. I mean, you can get to a point where he doesn't have a new thought after this or whatever. But certainly by this stage, we're seeing he's still growing, right? He is less dismissive of early Greek thinking by the end of this book than he was when he started writing it, right? Because specifically of his contact with Heraclitus and him finding in Heraclitus thoughts so close to his own about the event. And to me, that's both to the credit of the depth of Heraclitus as a thinker to continue to spark those kinds of thoughts later, and to Heidegger's non-systematizing charity, if I can put it that way, to have been open to seeing more in Heraclitus than he expected going in, where he thought these things would be, closed off to them, but found they weren't. This is all good stuff. There's one particular section toward the end where he's talking about the what he thinks Heraclitus saw. He's talking about all these things which are the same. See if I can find it. Yes, okay, this is right before the event of lighting. So he's just gotten through talking about what he means by the fire, right? Topire, the fire is ologos, right? So is the order of speech, reason, gathering. Its meditating is the heart, i.e. the lightning sheltering expanse of the world. This is on page 118 at the top, by the way. In a multiplicity of different names, phusis, pyre, logos, harmonia, polemos, eris, philia, hen, Heraclitus thinks the essential fullness of the same. So was there any part of that which was, if you pardon the expression, Greek to you? Didn't know what the words were, didn't know what he was trying to say there? And people have reactions to that claim. See when on the same page I'm on, or why I'm asking this?
Yeah, well, I mean, what I get, this series of Greek words,
So go ahead, Pete.
it's this is the traditional understanding of the pre-Socratics. Well, Heraclitus is always in flux and struggle, while Parmenides is nothing changes. And so this list of words, I'm not quite sure where philia fits in, but
He's contracting
they're all
eris with
action things
right.
going on.
So the phusis, nature, beginning, arising presence, whatever. Pyre, that's the fire that we just talked about. Logos, that's the the both speech or reason or order, gathering. The next one, the harmonin, that's the harmony, right? The harmony of things. Polemos, that's war. That's he's got a famous aphorism where he says, war is the father and the king of all. It makes some gods, some mortals, some slaves, and others free. Eris, that's strife, the idea that it is the strife of opposites, which is the cause of the variation in things. And then the parenthetical philia, that's the contrast of eros, right? Of eris, right? So strife and philia go together as the two things. Love and strife are the dichotomy of the gathering and separating of things. Philia is also the word that's used in the nature loves likes to hide, by the way. And then hen, the one, which is the one alone that is wise and steers all things through all things, and so forth. All of these are different terms for the governing order of the whole, something like that. And what Heidegger is saying here is that all of these are the same thing. They're talking about this lighting, sheltering expanse of the place or site where truth is appearing, unfolding, happening, right? And in each case, you've got a single word with lots of freight in it, but that is meant to describe how all things are and appear or cohere, and each of them is bringing out some aspect of that, right? The pyre is bringing out the living change aspect. The phusis is getting at the arising presence. The logos is getting at the the ordered structure. Similarly for the harmony, strife, etc. And one that there's a unifying oneness of the order through all of it. All of those are bringing out the leading moments of what? Of the being of beings, would be the claim. That the being of beings happens this way, right? And that the truth that appears in this open, right? The world's this way. It has all of these different quote characteristics, but there's not characteristics as things that are true of separate parts of it. There's things that are true of how being does the being thing, right? Okay. If that's understood, sorry, James, did you have a question about this? If that's understood, I want to jump back to page 114 for a second. So this is the one that says, we talk about still we think phusa superficially. He says, by doing so, we overlook what is decisive, the fact that self-revealing not only never dispenses with concealing, but actually needs it in order to occur essentially this way it occurs, as disclosing only when we think of phusis in this way, when we say the tophysin, the physics, the arising presence, instead of the not setting ever. And he says, both names designate the realm which the reciprocal intimacy of revealing and concealing governs and founds. Within this intimacy is hidden the uniqueness and oneness of Hen, the One, which early thinkers presumably beheld in the wealth of its simplicity, which has remained closed to posterity. And then he goes on to talk about the never going into concealment aspect. Okay. This claim. What does he claim about Heraclitus here? What does he claim about early thinkers here? Is it true? Has he shown any of this? Do you know what he's talking about when he's talking about this intimacy? Within this intimacy is hidden the uniqueness and oneness of Hen, the One which early thinkers presumably held in the vaults of a simplicity which has remained closed to posterity. What is he talking about here? Does anyone have any idea?
Well, I have like a hint, and it's with, he uses the word same. So like in the second paragraph,
Sure.
they are the same. And he doesn't mean they're the same in that they're equal.
No.
But that there's a connection between them. And this is, what's challenging to tease out here. Well, what's this connection he's seeing that makes these things the same?
So the same here is definitely being used as a term of art. It's the same that's that we found in the logos fragment as the wise is agreement, all is one part. Same saying is he was defining wisdom as the same and saying the same with the same, something like that. So the same is something like this term of art for not just the relation between things, but this what all things share, in that they are all participants in the being of beings, right? The thing which is uniting uniting what is the character of being, and the character of being appears in the formula is the same, right? And this is not a claim about being the highest genus or something like that, or a lowest common denominator or something like that. Instead, there's all kinds of like active, intuitively known noetic characteristics of what is that are not specific to only this little region of what is, but which are characteristic of what is as such, right? And that to me is what the same business is getting at. So I can understand. For me, it's straightforward. Well, not straightforward, but it's a philosophically difficult concept, but it's a graspable concept. What the same is, he's saying something in addition to that, though. Here, in my opinion, on 114, he's saying that there is a uniqueness hidden, the uniqueness and oneness of Hen. There's a uniqueness and oneness of the One, which isn't simply the same, of the One, which early thinkers presumably beheld in the wealth of its simplicity, and he's claiming, and that later thinkers do not. So is he claiming that later thinkers do not use the concept of the One? They certainly do, right? But he's claiming that they beheld it, with an immediacy and simplicity, and that later thinkers do not think of the One with that immediacy and simplicity. In other words, there's something about the One which becomes more obscure after the time of Heraclitus, and say by the time of Plotinus, where something like the event of the advent of metaphysics has happened and has made the One into some reified concept, which no longer has the immediacy and simplicity, and if I can put it this way, intuitive noetic contact that it has for Heraclitus. He's making a claim here about something like a dimming of revelation. Go ahead.
Right. This is his usual or post 1930s story of being hiding. And that's what's so to Heraclitus, the pre-Socratics, they were still in the light of physis, if you will. Being was directly accessible to them, but then with metaphysics, it's started getting hidden by metaphysics. So by Plotinus's time, he no longer has direct access to
I understand. I understand that's the claim. The question is, previously he had in the earlier sections even of this book, in the first fragment section, he had extended that claim to the pre-Socratics as such that they were already thinking metaphysically. And here he's allowing that Heraclitus has something like direct and intuitive access to the one that he had previously denied. So he's dating the eclipse later. That's the first point to notice. And second of all, he's not talking about it as it being particularly being that is occluded, but he's saying it's the one, right?
Yeah.
And that's an interesting shift in language, because it's not the one was way more of the term of art chosen by the later metaphysicians in that tradition, whereas being is definitely Heidegger's own term for it, right? You'll find both of them in Parmenides. I would put it to you that in this book, Parmenides was the one that we read, which Heidegger was the farthest from being in direct sympathy with. Heraclitus was the one he was closest to. And when we were still back on Anaxagoras, the interpretation seemed the most forced, and the surrounding material, which was much more voluminous, was much more dismissive of early Greek metaphysics as metaphysics, and therefore as part of the hiding of being. So we've gotten a revision of the opinion of the pre-Socratics in which they are elevated, but they're elevated specifically in the person of Heraclitus. But the term that's being used for the thing which he has direct access to, by the end of it, it's the lighting. Great, that's the point of contact with what he's doing in Heidegger. But he's not saying being here. He's saying that the one was beheld in the wealth of its simplicity, which has remained closed to posterity, in which he is including himself. I put it to you. He's not saying that being has remained closed to him, but he is saying that the wealth and simplicity of the one is closed to posterity. I don't see him excluding himself from that judgment. Am I wrong? I think he's making a very striking and nuancedly different historical claim here, and he hasn't fully justified it. But it's first important to just grasp what the claim actually is, and how it's not quite the same thing we've heard 50 times before, so to speak. And it's happening in the essay, in the midst of which he's basically going to be conceding, actually, Heraclitus saw this stuff, including the one.
Yeah, so in that sense, he's like he swings back and forth between, let's say, the traditional view, the Heraclitus and Parmenides are saying opposite things. In 35, he's saying, well, no, they're actually saying the same thing differently.
I think it's fair to say that they, just leaving aside what he says at different times, Heraclitus's overall message is much closer to Parmenides' message than the usual story lays on, right? Absolutely, right? Heraclitus is fundamentally a pantheistic, modest, living, intelligent, and souled universe kind of thinker, which is much less far from Parmenides than is usually led on, right? There's people that see him as just being an all-is fluxer, or even as a proto-materialist, and that's not the actual Heraclitus, right? So there, absolutely, you can just demolish a lot of that, easy, accentuating by contrast. I don't think that means that Heidegger has taken Parmenides as seriously, I'm going to say yet, as he has Heraclitus here. There'll be some other places where he re-engaged with Parmenides, where I think he does take him more seriously. But so far, he has been much less in sympathy with Parmenides than with Heraclitus. And here we're seeing the maximum of his sympathy with the pre-Socratic in his sympathy with Heraclitus. Sorry, go ahead, Pete.
I was just going to say, I really don't know why he brings up hen in this paragraph. It's like he suddenly went Neoplatonist on us for a paragraph, and I can't explain it.
Well, is there any of that in Heraclitus long before Plotinus? That's the first question. Did Plotinus invent the notion of the one? Or did Heraclitus say, the wise is one only, it is unwilling and willing to be called by the name of Zeus? Because he brought that up in the previous Heraclitus thing, right? There is a notion of the one in Heraclitus, is the point. And it's something close to a governing order that steers the whole, something like that. It's not simply the whole as the thing which appears, right? And in that sense, it has something in common with Heidegger's accentuating of the ontological difference of being not being simply the being of beings, but being something behind it, a higher and structuring and animating principle of it, something like that. That notion is already there in Heraclitus. Wisdom is one thing. It is to know the thought by which all things are steered through all things. That's again Heraclitus. And he says, of all the people I've read, none has attained to seeing that wisdom is separated from all. Right. So those are ways in which you find a thought in Heraclitus, which is closer to being a thought about the one that is not metaphysical in Heidegger's sense. He's not showing any disagreement with it here. He's not distinguishing it from himself as being covered over by a metaphysical obscuring of being. But it's darn closer to what a lot of the later tradition read into that concept than Heidegger is here letting on, right? It's not like it was the later thinkers that invented all that, and there was no precursors of it already in Heraclitus. There were. And he could take this occasion right here to say, and because he thought all these things, this is a clear example of where, although Heraclitus managed to understand these things about the lighting, which agrees with me, and they're therefore correct, he also had all these thoughts about the one, which just agree with later Neoplatonists. So this was clearly where he was getting all metaphysical and just reifying being and was wrong. Easiest possible move in the world. He doesn't do it. Why?
Because the Heraclitus, I'm assuming that the one is not the Neoplatonic one.
I claim that you don't know that, and it's an uncharitable reading of the Neoplatonists. So the point is, it's possible that that's true, right? And that the Neoplatonic understanding of the one is as shallow and metaphysical as Heidegger often wants to let on. But before this essay, we thought he was going to say that Heraclitus's understanding of the lightning appearing would be shallow and metaphysical. That's what he had set us up to think from chapter 1. But as soon as he actually came to grips with Heraclitus's actual thought, he found it was deeper than that, and it echoed many of the things that he found in himself, or that he had even seen in the parts of Plato that were maybe closest to him. And in that respect, he revised his opinion of Heraclitus upward. Well, Heraclitus is not a philosopher who doesn't have some of these one notions. And here we're not seeing him say, because he has all these one notions, he's really just a Christian before the letter or a Neoplatonist before the letter, and we can dismiss him as a metaphysician. He's not saying that at all. He's saying he seemed to have some direct intuitive access to what he was calling the one, which we don't have. So that's more like saying, I cannot verify the things he said about the one with any kind of direct phenomenological evidence that I can access myself, because I don't have his intuitions about these things. But I don't know that that means he didn't. And that's a way less ambitious or dismissal oriented reading of Heraclitus and that whole set of notions. And Heidegger has not given me any reason to extend, not to extend that degree of charity as to the amount of thought that there could be in that position and how grounded it could be in an actual intuition of things, as his other dismissals of later thinkers would let on.
It's certainly the case with Heidegger. If you go from the beginning to the later, he's constantly developing more better readings,
Yes.
More charitable
Yes.
readings of every philosopher he reads.
Correct. But there's a line where he never goes and reads charitably thinkers in certain schools. And the question is that just the accident of who he chose to read deep enough to develop that charity? Or is it because there's an actual obscuring in those schools of thought such that there's nothing clear to be found there? I don't think we know the latter. I think that at many times Heidegger makes arguments that makes one assume that he thinks the latter, but that doesn't mean he's proved it, right? I think there may be more continuity. I'm thinking of the people later in the middle part of the classical period and even the later part of the classical period. There may be more continuity of intuition and philosophical thought between them and some of the people like Heraclitus here than Heidegger lets on, in part perhaps because he can't enter into it, right? Just as there are things he can see in Heraclitus because they're close to things he can see, there may be things that these people can see in Heraclitus that we can't see in Heraclitus, because Heraclitus was closer to their way of thinking, right?
Right, and they had Heraclitus's book sitting on in their library.
At least some of them did, but I mean, by the time we're talking about the later portions of this, and it's 700 years after Heraclitus, they probably don't, right? They probably just have fragments very much like we have.
Well, in Clement's case, yeah.
Yeah. But certainly people like the Stoa who looked back to Heraclitus and said he is the founder of our school, they almost certainly had his books, right? And they thought that their whole, logos as the reason guiding the whole argument that they were elaborating, that we know as later Stoicism, they thought that that was fully in keeping with what they thought Heraclitus had taught them. We don't know that that's wrong. They had the book and we don't, and they were closer to him in both time and thought than we are, right? There may be more continuity between what the Stoa thought about things and what Heraclitus actually said in his full books than we can guess from just the fragments we have left.
Yeah, I mean that's completely reasonable.
Right. So next question. Is the wealth of the simplicity of the one, has it remained completely closed to posterity?
He wants you to think it is, so he can make his claim. No.
I agree. What evidence would you need to prove that statement? Or leave aside proof. To persuasively argue that that statement is an accurate presentation of what happened in the history of Western philosophy and Western metaphysics. I'm saying I just want to know, right? That claim, someone makes that claim, what evidence would they have to advance so that it would be persuasive to you? What would make that sound true? So go ahead.
He tried at Being in Time to say that we're at the end of history of metaphysics, but I think that's been, I can't say proven, but I don't think even he thought that towards the end of his life. They had to accept that, no, history didn't end there, sorry. It's just continuing. So, if we
can't. Well, history certainly hasn't ended, even if metaphysics as a juncture that he, at least at some points in his career, presented as closed by Nietzsche, having exhausted its essential possibilities, might be over. Let's put it that way, right? So the Nietzsche lectures doxographic position is that Nietzsche consummated the history of Western metaphysics and exhausted its essential possibilities by giving us, the will to power that turns into the view of technology, something like that. And that view is the final possibility of Western metaphysics, something like that. and a thinking that gets beyond Western metaphysics will have to not continue in that vein, but make a new beginning that gets outside that vein, something like that. So that's not a claim about history ending, it's a claim about metaphysics as a structure having a beginning, a middle, and an end. And its beginning is in the pre-Socratics, and its middle is the Socratics and Scholastics and moderns, and its end is Nietzsche. That's the underlying claim he's making about metaphysics as a structure. He's claiming it has a history, and Nietzsche is the last phase. So for that to be true, it would have to be true that things that came after Nietzsche aren't metaphysics or recapitulating positions that already were taken in within metaphysics, but are not doing anything fundamentally new with that structure or inside that structure. Now that can turn into a new true Scotsman argument if you're not careful, right? If it fits inside that structure, it's metaphysics, and if it goes outside that structure, it's a new beginning, right? So, you know, you have to beware of this claim being a tautology, right, rather than some actual substantive claim. But still, for all of that to be a coherent argument / position, there shouldn't be unexplored possibilities in the history of Western metaphysics that were antecedent to Nietzsche, happened during the whole history, were never really fully followed up, could be, and are still waiting there, right? If metaphysics as a structure still had 500, lively, realistic, possibilities left unexplored in it, then you wouldn't say it was a structure that was exhausted, unless you have some other reason for believing it can't go there, it can't go to those places, something like that. And then you'd be making a claim about not the structure or the thought, but the history, that, mankind wouldn't go there or something like that, which would need a different kind of evidence. Anyway, I'm not trying to stump for his position about the nature of this historical structure in the Nietzsche lectures of the 30s as being his last word on the subject. It was the position he had at the time, whatever. When I see things like this, what I'm seeing is something like a willingness to admit that there could have been things seen in earlier phases of metaphysics that might not have been followed up fully, and maybe they can't be now. I don't know. That would be a different claim to make, but they're not exhausted. There's no evidence here that the things that Heraclitus might have seen about the nature of the one when he had direct intuitive access to it are exhausted. I don't read exhaustion into that paragraph.
I thought the idea of metaphysics is it's beyond just our limitations.
The primary way he's saying about metaphysics here, and the way he's using it, is it's something like it's the particular thing that he sees as basically being inaugurated by Aristotle's book of that name, where you turn being into a concept and you make it into an object, and you try to think about it as an object. And having thought about it as an object, there's a structure that winds up causing, in which you get a doctrine of what is, a doctrine of what mankind's position is in that whole, a doctrine of what counts as truth, that fits those things together, and in addition to the what, a how being is, right? And that every position in metaphysics from Aristotle onward had to answer those 4 questions to fit in that structure, and that structure is what you're going to get whenever you try to turn being into an object. That's the claim, right? And his evidence for it is just he's written a history of Western metaphysics from the time of Aristotle down to the time of Nietzsche, where he can show each of these major successive phases, not every obscure figure along the way, but each of these major phases fitting into that scheme, answering exactly those 4 questions, and sharing that common premise, which they don't even acknowledge as a premise. They think they're fighting about everything, but they're not actually ever questioning that. They're keeping the same definition of being, and they're treating it as an object of the same kind. And then they all follow the structure as a result, which he thinks that structure is required by the coherence of making sense of the world if you start with that view. So when he's trying to talk about metaphysics, he's trying to talk about that historical body of thought, that, to use later words, that discursive formation, right? He's not trying to make the claim as being about what the metaphysicians think they're thinking about or trying to refer to outside of themselves, right? He's making a claim about a body of thought. And I think you can make a case for that, but part of that claim requires that the claim that is a structure that is finished requires the belief, or entails the claim that you can't make new variations in that scheme that are essentially unexplored, that have essentially more to tell us, right? It's meant to be an exhausted structure. It's meant to be a structure that has played out, rung its changes, gone as far as it can go, reversed itself. And some of that idea that it has reversed itself, I think, is indebted to Nietzsche's diagnosis of the history of Western philosophy, not just to Heidegger's own, right? The idea that this history is the highest values progressively devaluing themselves, right? That's a Nietzschean idea that he has taken over and fitted into this, if I can put it this way, more sophisticated historical understanding of how something like that happens. But in that idea that that's an exhausted structure, right? There's a notion that there's a trajectory there. You're taking things which were originally very abstract thoughts about the nature of the reality in which the human being is situated, something like that, and what truth is, and you're turning them more and more into something which man projects for his own purposes, and the purpose of each of those things becomes more and more instrumental over time. So it goes farther and farther from being an authentic engagement with the phenomena of how the world appears, and becomes more and more a means of governing man's conduct by changing the structure that they're reacting to, right? So by the end of it, it's become purely instrumental, and people are changing philosophies just to rule other human beings, not because they think something is true. That's the reversal that he thinks has taken place from the beginning to the end of that metaphysical
Wouldn't that have
structure.
really started with Machiavelli then? That would have been the first,
Well,
danger with that.
You can certainly make claims that some of that instrumental view of it comes in with the moderns specifically, right? But he doesn't trace that primarily to a change in the motivation, but also to a change in what they think is. As their understanding of what is becomes more subjective, the will moves to the forefront, right? The will and the human will becomes more important as the view of what truth is and what reality is becomes more subjective, because the will forming seems to be more of the truth of what is. And that move he wouldn't trace to a Machiavelli, but you trace to a Descartes. Descartes is part of the move to philosophy becoming more subjective that way. Starting from the desire of a certainty, you start inside, not outside, and etc. Right? So, but in his explanation, that's only one station along the way. It's not the decisive turn in it, but it's a piece of the whole thing becoming eventually more instrumental, so that the final version of it is, the Nietzschean version of it, of it's pure will, but a pure will that doesn't know the situation in which it is, to which it is reacting, thinking purely instrumentally about what truth is, winds up being driven to where it's going, right? So there's a passive aspect to it. That's what the question turning technology stuff is all about. There's an element of this which is not something man is just doing, but something that is happening to man, something like that. So that's the overall claim of this end of metaphysics claim. I think that what he's trying to claim there, it's a big claim, obviously, but I don't think that there's anything unsound about making claims like that about an historical structure of this kind, this large. You may talk about the ways in which it's indebted to Nietzsche's understanding of Western metaphysics as nihilism, and you can, say, but it's obviously overturning Nietzsche himself by including him in that structure, whatever. It has this complicated relation to Nietzsche of indebtedness to him and rebellion against him, or overturning of him. But along the way, for the diagnosis to be fair, we have to see a progressive pulling away from just honest testimony of the truth as it appears toward something like a subjectively calculated, interior, manipulated, twisted for purposes, pragmatic action thing, right? Where thought becomes praxis, right? So, and the station, in his diagnosis of the stations along the way, one of the first of them is turning experience, the ongoing events of experience, into objects. Objects are things that you can control in a way that you can't control experiences. Experiences happen to you, objects you can manipulate. The reification of the experience is a first power move from that is towards understanding truth as power, is what the underlying claim is here. Sorry, Dan.
Yeah, relating to what's happened these days with, I know, ChatGPT, that's to me, it's like pure Nietzsche. It's instrumentality, pure instrumentality. There is no reference. It's just technology taking the words and recreating that. And to me, it's kind of like the end is like the end of nihilism and the pure technology, and it's pure Nietzsche. But that's me.
Yes, I mean, but if I understand the claim, you have to ask yourself though, how much about the nature of language is actually involved in these things. If the nature of language makes some of these things possible, then put it this way, the truth in such things will out, and it's not simply a technology constructed by human beings for human purposes, right? The truth about what language is and how it works gets a vote in whether or not it is large language models that wind up reasoning, right? It's not like a Nietzschean philosophical founder decided that this shall be true and willed that it be so, right? The people doing these things may have had things they wanted to be so, but the things that are actually so are controlled by the nature of language and what actually worked. So I don't think it's as simple as because the thing has a technological instantiation that it is a power tool in the hands of man. I think that that's a too shallow an understanding of how truth comes into these things. Truth gets a vote in these things, and anyway, I don't think we know what any of the AGI sparks, inklings going on right now means in all this. I do not know that it's purely technological.
But so now I'm confused, because I could think about now is Heidegger's use of the hammer analogy, and okay, so how does that, because it is technology, it is extension of what we are. How does that play into the way he frames a hammer, and the locus of control there is our will. Again, what we want.
Yes, but the hammer is simple enough and does the things that we want because we constructed the hammer purely to fit into our purposes. But the simplicity of it is part of what allows the hammer to be only the hammer. The hammer never decides to be something else, right? And that's because the things that we're and that's because the things we're doing with it are simple enough, and so is it, right? Again, the part of Heidegger's take on technology that I think is needs to be paid attention to here is when he says that technology is a mode of revealing. It is one of the ways in which something true shows itself to man. It's not simply a tool in the hands of man, and it's a misunderstanding of technology to regard it as merely a tool in the hands of man. It's the specifically Nietzschean misunderstanding of it, right? But anyway, that's my own take on that. I mean, I know people may know that I've been doing a few just amusing things with these language models in terms of taking through their paces and seeing how they reason about philosophy. I've done a few more on that, including one on talking about something from this, but which I may put up on. There's a couple of them already up on the YouTube channel. One about Heidegger, one about the Theaetetus. But I'll have another one on something in this in the future. It's interesting. These things are verbally reasoning. I don't think it means they're remotely conscious. They're certainly not alive, but they are verbally reasoning, and that's already telling us something about the nature of language, in my opinion. Okay. Slight technological distraction moment. Craig, do you have any thoughts on this? I don't know if you've played with any of these things yet, or if you have thoughts on this. You do not. Okay.
But so I got lost. So you were asking about what remained closed to posterity,
Yes.
and
Specifically about the supposed intuitive simplicity or intuitive access to the one. Right.
right. So I'm not quite sure what to do with this one, because for me,
my initial question was, what evidence would you have to present to make this claim persuasive? You would have to show me that there was something like direct intuitive access to the one in Heraclitus's time, and that later there wasn't.
Yeah. Okay. So let's say the one is Physis, that Heraclitus, the things in the world just whooshed up for him, and that's been closed off to us now, because anything that appears to us already comes loaded with a bunch of baggage that all things must have. Let's say Heraclitus had direct access to the phenomena, whereas for us, the phenomena is always mediated because we've grown up in the modern world, or the world of metaphysics, or whatever. So Heraclitus had direct access. We don't, because things are all mediated for us.
So I understand the claim, but here's my counter, right? Heraclitus's access to those things was also mediated, but it was mediated by the language in which he thought about them, right? Not necessarily the previous thinkers, but the thought of the shapers of the language he used had as much influence on how he had access to those things as any later thinkers have on ours. And he is clearly reacting to and dependent upon the poetic and intimations in the words he is using and the language he is using. And we don't ever get to get away from that. There can be intuitive access to these things, both from the experience of living, embodied living, and from the language that shapes the way we think about these things, those two together. But if that's where the shaping comes from, it's not a variable, it's a constant. We have it, he had it, right? The extra thing that is supposedly making the difference is layers of intervening thinking that have added extra layers of theory between our phenomenal experiences and our original words and how we think about them. But if this essay is any evidence, those are the kinds of things that a philosopher can peel back if he tries, right?
Well, first you have the philosopher needs some intuition that there's something to peel back there, that it's not just a given.
Granted, but that is now a common possession of everyone who has learned from Heidegger. We can all potentially try to do what he did in this essay and peel back the layers between us and an earlier thinker in the same way that he peeled back the layers between himself and Heraclitus, to engage with the problematic Heraclitus engaged in, and to try to do what he did here and see what the earlier thinker thought by entering into his problematic ourselves.
Potentially, yeah.
You can't tell me that nobody can do X and then show me X being done at the same time. I'm going to believe what you showed me and not what you tell me, right? So he's showing he can understand Heraclitus here. So I'm going to think that it is possible to understand how other people earlier than us experience the simplicity of the one.
Yeah, he's doing hermeneutics, right? He's trying to understand.
It's a little more than that, because he's also trying to directly tie it to his own authentic, personal thought about these the things which are deepest for him, and that's where he's going to find that he and the earlier thinker can share enough space of problematic that their intuitions can meet, because they're about the same matter, they're about the same subject. He's showing communication is possible because he has to bring, yes, he has to bring his whole, set of concerns. He can't just adopt them from the earlier thinker, but he's not just doing hermeneutics on the language of the earlier thinker. He's bringing his whole, intuitive understanding of truth with him to try to get to the level where he and the earlier thinker share the same problem. And that's either possible or if it's not. If it's not possible, this essay fails. And if it is possible, then the claim that is closed off may be a historically true claim about so far, but that claim is contingent. Some good philosopher could do it tomorrow.
So Craig's been trying to say something.
Sure,
so
sure.
I have to be a great. I think you have to be a great philosopher, not just a good one. To get that.
The point is granted. Craig.
Question I have is, you use the word language. What happens if you substitute the word culture? A little broader than just the words itself, because I think language is one element of culture.
It's fair. The amendment is friendly. I mean, I would say that there are some ways in which thinkers are heavily indebted to their culture as well as their language. I picked language in part because Heidegger himself appeals to it as something, the embodied experience itself and direct noetic intuition that you get from that, and the shaping of language, or the language as house of being, are the two things he himself identifies as those things. So I'm just trying to stick with what he had sort of already granted. But I would grant you that yes, there's other aspects of culture that definitely matter for that. I do think that original thinkers can think outside of the box of their own time, but the main way that they do that is by re-engaging with the other peaks of the tradition. It's by the thing which liberates them from the sandbox of their own time is the fact that they are thinking of things all the way back to the Greeks, or things, whatever, maybe peaks from other cultures at times. But the culture in the sense of the whole tradition of one's that led to one's time, maybe you don't ever really get outside of that, but certainly the particular culture of one's particular time, one does get outside of, I think, precisely by doing things like this, by participating in the longer conversation, the deeper conversation, that isn't the only people from Kant to now, only people from Hegel to now, only people from Nietzsche to now. Those conversations will leave you stuck in your culture. But if you widen those, maybe you stay stuck in your culture of something influenced by the Western tradition. Fine, but you're not going to stay stuck in 21st century culture, if you get me. Are the amendments friendly?
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm gonna throw out some more, because
Sure.
as I add in the culture, that's also the carrier of a worldview that even though the English language has been fairly constant in the last 200 years, our view of the world has been radically different. So,
agreed. I just the only other thing I would add to that is a lot of people think that at any given time there's one worldview and there's really cacophony, and so yeah. Let's allow the synchronic variation within each time too.
See, the use of that word for that implies dissonance, massive dissonance. If it's a cacophony of worldviews, they're all clashing together, trying to make augmented chords in the wrong place, like jazz you love so much.
He's joking because he knows I hate jazz. Sorry, I have to plug in my headset. Sorry, Pete, did you not
so
get a
let me
chance to finish?
explain an example of how things get cut off for posterity. And Socrates believed the philosophy could only be done through dialogue. He was against writing anything down. And so you could see maybe the evolution of philosophy was that Thales had a conversation with Anaximander, who talked to Heraclitus, who talked to Empedocles, who talked to Socrates, and then Plato wrote stuff down, and then we lost this direct transmission through dialogue from master to tutor or whatever.
Of course, Plato wasn't the first to write things down, but keep going.
And then once we lost that direct teacher dialogic connection, and there's a generation that only learned philosophy by reading texts rather than engaging in dialogue, that generation has now lost something, according to Socrates. Because they're going through the text, they're not going through direct.
Sure, but I mean, obviously, the tradition of having a human teacher and dialogue with a human teacher, continues long after these things get written down. What actually happens from having things written down is that you also get additional threads of transmission to a later student from a teacher who is not his immediate generation's predecessor, but that reach farther back, past and through them.
But Socrates says you've lost something.
Yes. What Socrates says that you've lost is the ability of the living teacher to give you the responses, but he's thinking of the situation where you only have the book in front of you and you don't have the living teacher. He's not thinking of the situation where, in addition to having the living teacher, you've got 20 generations of books in front of you. Of that, he has no criticism. When he describes what his favorite activity with friends, it's he goes through the books of the ancients, and whenever they can find something worthy, they pull it out and they consider it a great gain if they are this way useful to one another. You find that in Xenophon's Memorabilia, talking about Socrates, right? That he says that they went through books together. So he may not have written books, but he read them, and he did this with his students. So if we're talking about a form of transmission that loses the human mentoring teacher connection, then you would have a case. But I don't think that that's simply a reason to not write things down. It's not a good reason to not write things down.
I'm not getting into the argument of should we just be oral or written.
Yeah.
It's just an example of something getting lost that Socrates was already talking about.
Well, he was certainly talking about the possible things getting lost, but that doesn't mean that it's an example of something being lost, right? It's a possibility. If you only got your notions of Aristotle from books with no teachers who knew Aristotle, you would get a distorted picture of Aristotle, right? We've run the experiment in the Middle Ages. We can affirm that this is true, right? But how did that resolve itself? The answer is some people who studied Aristotle well enough actually grasped it enough that they could start teaching it in that mentor way again. And there didn't need to be a completely intact apostolic tradition of the interpretation of Aristotle, so to speak, right? It was possible to recover from a break in the tradition by a sufficient.
How do you know?
Well, I'm speaking of the history as we do know it, by a sufficiently careful and charitable and et cetera, reconstruction of the thinker's original thought with his original text in front of us. Now you could say, well, but that still led to a distorted version of Aristotle compared to, as a theoretical possibility, it may be admitted as the difference between how well people knew Aristotle after they had been taught by Averroes the commentator versus how well they misunderstood Aristotle 400 years before, right? There's no comparison, right? One is recognizably Aristotle, and the other was, an amalgam with, a lot of late Hellenic attempts to homogenize him with Plato and so on, right? and we can tell that one is much closer to the original than later. And so you can go in the direction of a greater faithfulness to an earlier thinker without an oral tradition between. We know that that can happen. So in the same way, it's entirely possible that studies like this can make the depth with which we understand Heraclitus go not down but up between the time that Nietzsche is writing his little book on the pre-Platonics, which isn't very good, and the time Heidegger is writing this. And it's not the time passing between them that makes the difference. The difference is when Heraclitus, not Heraclitus, when Heidegger engaged with Heraclitus, he's doing so with a greater care, a greater charity, but especially a greater hunger, because he believes it more likely possible that Heraclitus has something fundamentally to teach him than Nietzsche believed. Nietzsche thought that anything that Heraclitus had to teach him, Nietzsche, was likely to be trivial and likely to be something that people had already said and passed down to him long since. And coming to the subject with that kind of prejudice, of course, he didn't find very much in Heraclitus, right? Even though he liked him best of all the pre-Socratics, right? He didn't find very much in him because he was not expecting very much of him, right? Heidegger goes there, ready to be wowed, ready to be surprised, but still expecting that he's in the end going to be able to dismiss him as a metaphysician. And he ends by telling us that he is the thinker who goes in the direction of the lighting of the event, right? So, which is as close to ringing endorsement as Heidegger is capable of, right? So, if you could have differences that stark in effectively a generation and a half between Heidegger and Nietzsche in an almost direct, not mentoring relationship, but an almost direct line of succession, right? Two removes maybe, then I think it's clear that you can go either way in these things. It's not the case that if something is closed off, it will never come back.
Right. Well. So I agree with you. Heidegger's a much more careful reader, generous reader of Heraclitus, but that's not to say that there's something that Heidegger can never get out of Heraclitus's fragments.
That's entirely possible. That's entirely possible.
That was closed to posterity.
It's possible, but it requires evidence.
But that's kind of evidence of a negative, right? I would have to know
Here is evidence you could give me that the one was intuitively accessible to Heraclitus and closed off to posterity. You would have to show me that you can find deep philosophical reflections on the one that you can see are appealing to immediate noetic intuitions, immediate intellectual intuitions in Heraclitus or someone closely adjacent to him. And you would have to show me that there are that the people who think and teach about the one later have no such comparable insights or arguments, which would have to be pretty comprehensive in how much you'd have to read them very charitably to determine that, right? And if at the end of all that you couldn't, in addition, then you could say that it's been closed off for that period of time. Even in the course of doing that, you might wind up recovering something like the access that you claimed had been eclipsed in the meantime.
Right. So if I could see what had been lost, then it
wouldn't be entirely lost, right?
Right. So it's kind of a tautology that if I could ever prove that something had been lost, then it's not lost. So I can never prove that something had been lost.
I think for some other things you might be able to prove that they have been lost, but
well, I know that they can be lost because there's things we read in Homer, Sophocles that just don't make any sense to us anymore. We're going on, we kind of get what's going on, and then Antigone says something that just doesn't make any sense to us anymore. I
am so far not entirely convinced, but but I can certainly concede that it is possible to lose things. We know that it's possible to lose things. We lose things ourselves all the time. So it is possible to lose things. The particular claim here was that the something as lasting, fundamental, philosophically massive in Western thought as a notion like the one was a possible subject of direct noetic intuition at one time and not later. Every positivist would say it's never been an object of possible direct intellectual intuition, and every Platonist would say if it was once, it can be again. But he is saying instead it was once and now is no more, and that's a different kind of claim. And I'm not convinced that he's proven it.
So Heidegger is saying that stuff can be lost to posterity.
He's not just saying that stuff can be lost for posterity. He's making that claim about the particular topic of noetic access to something as apparently timeless in the structure of Western thought as the notion of the one. Right. And there's plenty of people that would say the notion of the one is so abstract and so unconcrete that we cannot have an intellectual intuition of it. And Kant can make an argument like that and therefore say it will always be an abstraction and you don't have an object, and therefore your sensuous intuition on it is completely untrustworthy. So there's no intuitive access to something like that. Kant could make that argument, and he'll also say, and by the way, that was true in Heraclitus's time as well. And Heraclitus didn't have any access to it either. Right. And if he thought he did, he was deluding himself. Right. A Kantian position like that would make a certain sense, and a Plato could come along and say, yes, he had intellectual access to it, and if someone like Kant doesn't, it's because he doesn't believe he can, and he try, and whatever, right? Both those positions are staking out something which is comprehensible on its face. And if you make the claim to me that it was possible, but it went away, I can easily fit that in the Platonic position. If you're just making a claim about the went away of wasn't actualized, right? But not possible is a different claim, because the not possible is where it turns less on how we did it, and this is the agency thing again, and more on something like the one closing itself off to us, as though the one just stopped revealing itself. It's the same structure, it's still there, our minds are equivalent in capacity, we could turn towards it and pay attention to it with all the charity that he brings to a subject like this, but if it's closed itself off to us, we can't reach it. That's the kind of claim I hear him making, right? And I don't think he's shown it. But it's a striking claim. When someone makes this striking a claim, I sit up, I pay attention, right? He's not making the usual claim that a Kantian or a positivist would make, that this thing is never of intuitive access, although a Platonic one with a historical coda of this is always possible, but it hasn't been actual since Heraclitus, right? Both of those are, in their own schools, uncontroversial claims. I'm on the latter side of it, right? Between them. But he's instead making the claim, Heraclitus could see this, but metaphysics having intervened in it now, the one is closed. There is no more revelation of the one possible to intellectual intuition. Henceforth, I see the claim. I don't see the evidence for the claim.
Yeah, I just don't know what the one meant to Heraclitus.
So you're on the side of the Kantians and the positivists, right? In that point.
No. I'm just saying.
You don't know whether he had intellectual access to it because you don't know what it's referring to.
No, I don't know what he meant by it. So Kant saying universally we don't have access to the one.
Yes.
Well, we don't know what Heraclitus meant by the one. Obviously something different from Kant. So Kant can't
not necessarily. I mean, two people could be talking about the same thing and they can disagree about it. One of them is right and one of them will be wrong. They don't have to be talking about different things. They don't have to mean different things by the word just because they're disagreeing about what can be done with regard to it. They could be disagreeing about the substance, not the word. And one of them could be wrong.
Right. If somebody's making a claim about the number one and somebody else could make the opposite claim and one person's wrong, the other one's right, because they're both talking about the number one.
Yes.
But when Heraclitus is talking about hen, I'm not sure I'm confident that I understand what Heraclitus meant by it.
fair, because you're talking about your confidence in what you understand. So absolutely fair. But different if you're thinking that when Heidegger here makes the claim himself that he can tell that Heraclitus had a direct intuitive access to them, right? Which early thinkers presumably beheld in the wealth of its simplicity, which has remained closed to posterity. When he makes a judgment like that, he's thinking he does know what he meant by the one, and he also knows that he could see it, but I can't. Different claim than you're making, right?
Right. So you're saying Heidegger thinks he knows what Heraclitus meant.
Yes, he thinks he knows what Heraclitus meant by the one. He thinks Heraclitus knew what he meant by the one, and he thinks Heraclitus could see the one and have direct intellectual intuition about it, but Heidegger can't. It's an unusual claim. You should pay attention to these things when people claim things like this. It's a subtle claim. I don't think we're going to decide this. It's something worth pondering over here. Heidegger likes to say at times, some things give us food for thought. That line gave me food for thought. Let's put it that way. Okay. I want to give people a chance to ask their questions about any of the parts that we haven't gone over. I realize we didn't go through things quite as systematically, but I think that's fine. We're wrapping the book, so these higher considerations of the nature of his claims about metaphysics and so on are very much in order. I want to give people a chance to do that, and then I just want to briefly outline what I want the reading to be for this one next time, and we can talk about a date. But before you get to that, are there parts of this, either the book or the whole thing or the last essay, that people want to raise, ask questions about, anything like that? Craig?
There's still the nagging concern, which I think you addressed a little bit in the way you were talking last time, is to what extent the fragments reflect the full person's thought patterns. And if you can dig something out of the fragment that is significant enough, which is what you were kind of arguing earlier, just a few minutes ago, then I can understand it. But the other side of it is the frustration of any ancient writings that are fragments. You have the fragments, and then you have sort of the antagonists about the fragments that survive, sort of like Gnosticism, for an example. And to what extent, that's been a big issue. To what extent did Gnosticism get appropriately discussed by the people who were dissonant the whole time? And I've had this kind of nagging thought in the back of my mind that we basically have been looking for this whole book at a few sentences, and to what extent that reflects the complexity of early Greek thinking is, I think, an unanswerable question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Heidegger fleshed out those few sentences by bringing in a whole, barge worth of interpretation of Western philosophy to fit them into, and that's why you can, try to get these snippets to have enough depth in them, so to speak, whether it's accurately historically or not, to sustain a book, right? A book of this length, maybe a book of twice this length. My own sense is that there is enough in some of these things that I feel like we barely scratched the surface, and it's not like there's so little there that we cannot, find anything in it without reading it all in, but instead that attending to these things with the care that they deserve, we have, only looked at maybe 5% of what I can see as philosophically weighty in the fragments we have of Heraclitus, and less than 10% of what we have in the fragments of Parmenides. And by the end of some of the other things we might look at, those numbers may go up, but it's still the case that I could easily see spending, multiple semester courses on Parmenides and on Heraclitus and not remotely exhausting what they have to tell us. If our standard were something like historical certainty about them, we might be disappointed, but certainty is not available. It's not my standard, right? That it sparked philosophical thought is my standard, and I think that they can definitely do that. Not all thinkers, of which we have only a little bit, have that weight for me. I think that the stuff he did with Anaximander, for example, I don't think there's enough there in an Anaximander to sustain even the amount that he did on it, right? I think Parmenides and Heraclitus, we know enough about, not just from the fragments, but from their influence in later philosophy and all the ways other people reacted to them and the schools they spawned and all that kind of stuff. That I think they're weighty enough thinkers in themselves that we can find plenty to hang on them, so to speak. Are we bringing a bunch of that with us? Absolutely, but that's how traditions work, right? But is this addressing your concerns, or are you still just, you know?
It's interesting though that from my survey through here, the one that's gotten the most full-length books written about his philosophy, based on what everybody else said, has been Anaximander, like Carlos Rovelli's book, and a few of those. Those people are writing whole books about, and you find out that most of what's in there is not original to Anaximander, but is what other people said about him. So, so that's what's fascinating.
I mean, and maybe because those are easier to engage with. I mean, you don't need. I think you need to be a philosopher at a pretty high level to read Parmenides and Heraclitus with the depth that they deserve. And I think it's if you come to them with less than that depth, you're going to get, you know, Nietzsche's Basel book, right? And it's, you know, there's not very much you're going to get that way. But if you look at some of the better secondaries in the modern on Heraclitus, for example, they'll try to, you know, sum him up in a 200-page book, and they'll do a decent job, but you can tell that it's still, you know, on the surface. You won't find anything as deep as this idea of the lighting that you get here in those books, right? Nothing like it, right? And that's because Heidegger can see that thought, and because he can see that thought, he can see Heraclitus thinking that thought, and not everybody can, right?
And that's the thing that just clicked on me when you said the barge, bringing in the barge. Barges carry ore and barges carry garbage.
Okay, you're triggering me because we didn't do the asses prefer hated gold. So I have to. One of the things he says towards the end there is the little aphorism: asses prefer hated gold. And everybody gets the surface meaning of it, but I have to just run this by everybody. Heraclitus never says anything with one meaning. So did anybody see the second meaning of asses prefer hated gold? The first meaning is, you know, if you don't know what you're doing, you will prefer something, worthless to the glittering gleam, and that's the way Heidegger puts it. Of, you know, of this beautiful, true, precious thing, whatever. But there's a second meaning. What Heraclitus is saying. Did everyone get it? Did anyone get it? The ass is right. The straw was once alive, so it can actually feed him, and the gold is worthless. The gold only has value by convention. It just glitters, but it's objectively useless and good for nothing. But the straw, merely because it was once alive, can actually nourish any living thing, right? So the ass looks foolish, but the ass is seeking a natural good that is more real than the purely conventional good. And it's easy to miss that double meaning because everybody assumes that the conventional standard of value is the correct one, and they don't recognize that a conventional standard of value and a natural standard of value can conflict, etc. I think Heraclitus is always playing with double meanings like this. Anyway, Jim.
I wanted to comment a little bit on what Pete had said about 5 or 6 minutes ago. And I get the sentiment, Pete. You know what I mean? It's difficult because we want to grasp it and access it better. And I think, you know, I like I was saying, what about this? You know, what if we didn't get the fragment right, and then you're off on this trail and I don't even know if I should really think deeply, because maybe I'm grasping at something that's not really there to begin with because of the how far back it goes in history. That's one part of me. The other part of me is like, you know, though, it seems like Heraclitus reached down and from the depths drew up something to get that kind of thought in the first place, which to me is like that primordial chaos thing. And we're reaching back and doing the same thing. You know, he accessed something that invites you into another world, at least in my mind. The experience of it does, even from these little short phrases. And whatever it is he was grabbing that from, whatever that, it seems to kind of get through history anyway. And it invites us to do the same thing, which is probably the most important thing. in spite of the fact that it frustrates the hell out of me with my need for precision. You know, I'm an engineer, so I like precision. I want to know the steps, I want to know the signal path, everything, and I get that. But in a way, that's good that this kind of thing is always going to be like that. I don't know. That's just the way I felt. I feel like Pete,
You're thinking specifically of the fact that you don't know if you have any idea what Heraclitus meant by the one. And the point is, the only way you're going to find out is not to go look back in Heraclitus, but to go down to the same soup from which he drew out that thought and try to draw out your own thoughts about it, something like that.
Yes. And I felt bad for Pete because I felt maybe I feel the same way you do about these things. So I understand. That's all.
So I think the reason we read people like Heraclitus is because he reached deep, and so it's still worth reading him. But at the same time, for example, there's a word Heraclitus uses that nobody else used. Do we have any reference from antiquity? So we just have no idea what the word means. And, unless we come across a dictionary that has that from 25 centuries ago, we'll just never know. So some things are cut off in just that simple sense that we don't know what this word means.
Right, but see, that's part of like what I think Heidegger's right when he says, some of the things, even with what you were mentioning about Socrates, I'm okay with that because that's the precious thing those people got to have. That's theirs, not ours. That interaction like that, which makes each life more precious because you're the only one that gets to have that. We can look back on it, and I guess we're extracting the logos or whatever it was that comes from that. But I think that that's a proper boundary around people, and that even the time they lived in, that we can hope that we maybe get the same thing with others, like we're having. We get to have this with each other. People can watch a video, but it won't be the same. I think at one time in my life I might have lamented that more, like not being able to. I wish I lived in this time, and I wish this isn't going to happen. I've got these people, and I've got this life, and I'm glad to have it. Yeah. I hope I could see it with the value it has now, the way someone who, let's say, we're philosophers that people like 200 years, right? He was talking about all this deep stuff. It's from this time, and I wish I could have been in that conversation, but we might have not have seen the beauty and value of it in the moment we're having, so if we could do that, I guess that makes it worth it. I'll shut up now. I'm being too sentimental.
There's another good example in terms of what Pete was bringing up, not necessarily from philosophy, but from some teaching I did a while back, and that is the word arsenokotai, which is in one of Paul's letters, and it's been translated over the last few thousand years or couple thousand years in very, very, very many ways, with the most recent one being homosexuals, and so now it carries a political baggage because it's one of the texts used to be critical of homosexuality. And it turns out we don't know where the word came from. We don't really know what the word really means, but nobody wants to admit to that. They want to dig into the politics of it without even dealing with the fact that the word is almost unknown. And it's actually, the irony of it is the best translation or the best understanding they're getting to it right now is more like priests fondling little children as opposed to homosexuals. And I think there's an amazing irony in that, given the current situation in the church. So another example of words that we have no idea where they came from, but we project our own desires.
I'll give a slightly less charged example of the kind of we don't know. This is purely a science thing, but I mean, one of the, I was involved in some stuff. We were looking into Eratosthenes, the guy who invented the seed of Eratosthenes and the Alexandrian philosopher. But we were interested in how much he knew about stars. He wrote a star catalog, and anyway, wanted to know how many primes he enumerated with his sieve and these kinds of historical questions. But as part of that, we were researching, of his different predictions, how close did he get to some of them? And it turns out he gave a prediction of the distance between the Earth and the Moon. But we're trying to assess how accurate his prediction was. And the biggest error bar on it, the reason we don't know how accurate his prediction was, is a purely conventional unit that he cites in his explanation, right? We don't know how long that particular stadia was, right? It was like some particular location, the distance from here to here at this particular stadium for this particular Olympiad or whatever, and we don't know what that measurement was. It's just a purely conventional unit. So we can check all his geometry, we can check all his calculations, we know exactly what he means in terms of how many of those units. We don't know how long that unit is because it's just a conventional measurement. And so, you know, it could be an inch or 3 longer or shorter, and then he'd be 3% off or 10% off or 1% off. And so we can't tell how accurate his prediction was because we just don't know the exact meaning of his unit. Anyway, so things can get lost that way and you'll never know. It's fine. I want to talk about the what we want to do next. So we already mentioned it's gonna be this book. The first reading we want to read is part 1, lectures 1 to 4. So it has an introduction which you can skip. I think that's just from the translator. But it's divided into a part 1 and 2. There's 10 lectures in the first and 11 in the second, so 21 all told. We're going to do the first 4 lectures. There's a section towards the end of it about the tree in bloom, as Jim was talking about earlier, which I particularly wanted to include in the first session. So there's lots of other stuff before it, but make sure you get to the tree in bloom. It's like the critical thing I want to make sure we talk about. The tree in bloom section in chapter 4. Because these were given as lectures, they have this characteristic that they'll have like the new material, and then they'll have like a summary at the end where they, you know, goes over some of the ground again and so forth. It's still worth reading all those because he does sometimes introduce new material at the end of one of these things. They'll be labeled summary and transition in the text. And sometimes the stuff which comes into the transition part of that is more important than you might think if you thought it was just a summary. So don't skip those, if that's what I'm saying. What's the general topic? The general topic is, okay, what is what's thought-provoking in this thought-provoking age is that we still are not thinking. That's the first claim. And then he's also going to spend the whole, well, a big part of the first half on this, on Nietzsche and this one saying of Nietzsche: the wasteland grows, woe to him who hides wastelands within. So he's going to connect this to any thoughts about modern nihilism and some analysis of Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and how Nietzsche thinks about something like becoming, something like that. So there's elements of that which may recapitulate a little bit of information of stuff you've seen from the Nietzsche lectures if you read those, but it's some of its direct engagement with some of the themes, etc., of Zarathustra. So basically, by the end of the first section, we'll be through that Zarathustra stuff. The last 2 lectures in part 1 get to a deeper philosophical weight, and so I want to do those as their own thing. So the plan is we're going to do the first 4, the next 4, then the next 2, and so 3 sessions on part 1. Part 2 will eventually get to some other things, which will take us back to the early Greeks, this time with Parmenides instead of Heraclitus. So we'll be coming back to some of the things we're talking about today. Anyway, that's just a brief outline of what we're going to do and what is called thinking. The thing for next time, the first 4 lectures, and pay special attention to the tree in bloom in lecture 4. You'll know it when you get there. All right. Any thoughts or questions on any of that? All right. Thanks everyone for coming then. If there's more any final questions, or all right, then I'll see you guys. Oh, sorry, we have to think time. We have to figure out the next time.
What day? I was going to notice that.
Exactly. I can do May 14th, if that works for people. That'd be 4 weeks from now.
Hang on, I think that's Heidegger Circle, I think.
Oh, you got an event that day?
Yeah, I'll be in Boston. Let me just check here.
Okay.
May 14th. Yeah, it's Heidegger Circle. I'll be in Boston.
Would the 21st be better for you?
I'm free the 21st.
All right, let's do the 21st then, so people have, you know, extra time to get the book, and we can make sure we can let Pete attend. I'm out the weekend after that, but the 21st I'm around, so 21st would work for me. All right, May 21st then. And as usual, I'll put up the video of this stuff later tonight. Got an event, so maybe a little bit later than normal, but it'll get up. All right, thanks everybody.